Red Hollow. Kentucky isn't the kind of place strangers usually settle into, which is why everyone noticed when Paul showed up during the autumn of 2017. At 28, I'd been running the local hardware store on Chestnut Avenue for about 5 years after taking it over from my father, and in a town where everybody knows everybody's business, a new face stands out like a neon sign in a cornfield. Paul was different from the usual drifters who passed through. He had this quiet, methodical way about him, always wearing the same faded denim jacket with copper buttons that caught the light in odd ways. He rented the old Garrison building near the town square, the one that had been sitting empty since the antique shop closed down, and within a week he'd hung up a hand-painted sign that read, "Radio Repair, all makes, all ages," in neat, precise lettering that seemed almost too perfect to be done by hand. The thing about Red Hollow is that we still loved our radios, old habits from when the town was more isolated, before reliable internet reached every corner of the county. Most families had at least one vintage radio gathering dust in their attics, inherited from grandparents who used to huddle around them for evening programs back when Roosevelt was president. Paul's timing couldn't have been better, really, because there'd been this wave of nostalgia hitting the older folks, wanting to hear those old tubes warm up again, wanting to share that crackling magic with their grandchildren. Within his first month, half the town had dropped off their broken radios at his shop, and the remarkable thing was that Paul never turned anyone away, never said a radio was too far gone or beyond repair. He'd just nod, write your name on a yellow tag with that same precise handwriting, tie it to the radio's cord, and tell you to come back in exactly 3 days. Never 2, never 4, always exactly 3 days. The first radio I brought him belonged to my grandmother, a 1952 Zenith with a mahogany case that hadn't worked since I was in middle school. Paul ran his fingers along the wooden grain like he was reading Braille, then opened the back panel without even looking for the screws, his hands just knowing where everything was supposed to be. He pulled out components I couldn't name, examined them against the window light, and made these small humming sounds, not quite a tune, but more like he was having a conversation with the machine itself. 3 days later, when I picked it up, that radio didn't just work. It played clearer than it ever had, picking up stations from Louisville, Nashville, even Chicago on clear nights, when before it could barely catch the local AM station from 2 towns over. Paul charged me $30, which seemed almost insulting for the miracle he'd performed. But when I tried to tip him extra, he pushed the money back across the counter with his fingertips, like touching it too long might burn him. By November, Paul had become something of a local celebrity, though celebrity might be too strong a word for someone who rarely spoke above a whisper and never attended any town functions. People would see him at Nora's Diner every morning at exactly 6:15, sitting in the corner booth with black coffee and wheat toast, reading newspapers from cities none of us had ever visited: Detroit, Philadelphia, Seattle. Always from dates 3 weeks old, which Nora special ordered for him, though she never said why. His workshop lights stayed on until 2 or 3 in the morning, and if you walked past late enough, you could hear the sound of multiple radios playing simultaneously, creating this weird symphony of overlapping voices and static that made your teeth ache if you listened too long. But the strangest thing, the detail that should have warned us all, was that Paul never owned a radio himself, at least not one that anyone ever saw him use or carry, despite spending every waking hour surrounded by them. The first real sign of trouble came through Beverly Hutchinson's kitchen radio, a cream-colored Motorola from 1964 that Paul had repaired just before Thanksgiving. Beverly called me at the hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice shaking like autumn leaves, asking if I could come over right away and bring my grandmother's radio with me. When I got to her house on Sycamore Road, she was sitting at her kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea, staring at the Motorola like it might bite her. She told me to wait until exactly 4:30, then turn on both radios and listen. At 4:29, the regular country music station was playing some Hank Thompson song, but the moment the clock hit 4:30, the music dissolved into static, then cleared into a voice I didn't recognize. A man speaking in measured tones, describing how Beverly had buried her late husband's gambling debt notices in the backyard last spring, how she'd burned them one by one in a metal trash can at 3 in the morning, while crying so hard she could barely see the flames. Beverly and I sat there in stunned silence as the voice continued, describing details only she could have known. The pattern on the metal can, the way she'd worn her husband's old bathrobe over her nightgown, how she'd said a prayer for forgiveness after each document turned to ash. Then the voice shifted, and suddenly it was describing my morning routine from the previous day, how I'd stood in front of my bathroom mirror for 12 minutes debating whether to shave, how I'd eaten cereal straight from the box while reading yesterday's mail, how I'd called my ex-girlfriend's number just to hear her voicemail message before hanging up without leaving anything. The broadcast lasted exactly 7 minutes. Then both radios snapped back to the country station as if nothing had happened, right in the middle of Patsy Cline singing about falling to pieces. Beverly asked me to take her radio with me, said she never wanted to see it again, and when I picked it up I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Tiny scratches on the bottom that looked like initials, though not Beverly's initials or her husband's, but something that looked like a catalog number, BH047. Word spread through Red Hollow faster than wildfire in August, and by that evening, at least a dozen people had discovered their repaired radios were broadcasting similar invasive narratives at specific times throughout the day. George Whitman heard his radio describing the affair he'd had 20 years ago in Louisville, down to the name of the motel and the color of the bedsheets. The Carpenter twins' radio revealed where they'd been stealing copper wire from construction sites. And poor Nancy Dawson's old Philco announced to her entire bridge club that she'd been writing romance novels under a fake name and hiding the money in a separate bank account her husband didn't know about. Each broadcast lasted exactly 7 minutes, always at different times for different radios, and always containing information that the owners swore nobody else could possibly know. The hardware store became an impromptu meeting place that night, with people bringing their cursed radios wrapped in blankets and garbage bags. Some folks so spooked they'd remove the batteries and still claimed they could hear whispers coming from the speakers. Sheriff Garrett, a bear of a man who'd been keeping order in Red Hollow since before I was born, initially thought it was some kind of elaborate prank, maybe kids with broadcasting equipment trying to stir up trouble. But when his own repaired radio, a 1948 Crossley his father had left him, started describing how he'd falsified evidence in a drug case to protect his nephew, his whole demeanor changed. He organized a group to go to Paul's shop that very night, taking me along since I'd been the first to experience the broadcasts with Beverly. The workshop was dark when we arrived around 9:30, but the door was unlocked, which should have been our first warning that something was deeply wrong. Inside, the front room looked normal enough. Workbenches covered in radio parts, soldering irons neatly arranged, boxes of vacuum tubes sorted by size and type. But there was a smell underneath the motor oil and heated metal. Something organic and wrong, like overripe fruit mixed with copper pennies. And all of us noticed how the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees the moment we stepped through the doorway. Sheriff Garrett found the hidden door behind a filing cabinet, cleverly concealed but not impossible to spot once you knew something had to be there. The cabinet slid aside on hidden rails, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into what must have been a basement nobody knew existed. The garrison building's original plans showed no lower level. The smell got stronger as we went down, and we could hear something mechanical running, a rhythmic clicking and whirring like an old film projector crossed with a typewriter. The room at the bottom was maybe 20 feet square, lit by dozens of small red bulbs that gave everything a darkroom quality, and every wall was lined floor to ceiling with recording equipment, reel-to-reel tape machines, professional microphone setups, and hundreds upon hundreds of cassette tapes in plastic cases. Each cassette was labeled with a name and date, and when Sheriff Garrett started reading them aloud, we realized they were all people from Red Hollow, some who'd moved away years ago, others who'd died, and at least 30 names none of us recognized at all. The centerpiece of the room was a massive wooden table, covered in what looked like surveillance equipment from different decades. Old telephone switchboard components, telegraph keys, primitive recording devices I'd only seen in museums, and modern digital recorders all wired together into some incomprehensible network. But what made us all stop breathing was the far wall, where Paul had created a map of Red Hollow using pushpins and colored thread, with photographs attached to various locations, photos taken through windows, showing people in their homes, in their most private moments. There was Beverly burning her husband's papers, George Whitman meeting his lover at a motel, Nancy Dawson typing at her secret computer, and dozens more, each photo time-stamped from years before Paul had supposedly arrived in town. Sheriff Garrett pulled down one photo of a young woman named Catherine Brennan, and written on the back in Paul's precise handwriting was, KBR 031, disappeared April 2008, recordings complete, awaiting broadcast window. Catherine Brennan had been reported as a runaway 9 years ago, just another troubled kid who'd left for the big city, except now we were staring at evidence that suggested something far worse. Sheriff Garrett immediately called for backup from the state police while the rest of us stood frozen in that red-lit room, afraid to touch anything else we might find. Behind another stack of equipment, Deputy Collins discovered a leather journal filled with pages of notes about radio frequencies and human consciousness, about how certain wavelengths could carry more than just sound, how they could preserve what Paul called essential narratives of a person's existence. The last entry, dated just that morning, simply read, "They know now, time to migrate the collection to Location C. Must preserve the archived voices before they understand the complete process." We found Paul 2 hours later at the bus station 3 towns over, sitting on a bench with a single suitcase that contained nothing but clothes and more cassette tapes. These ones labeled with names from other states, other towns we'd never heard of, going back nearly 40 years according to the dates. He didn't resist arrest, didn't say a word except to ask if we'd touched the equipment in the basement. And when Sheriff Garrett said yes, Paul's face went white as fresh paper, and he whispered something about containment protocols being broken. The state investigators spent 3 weeks in that basement, cataloging everything, and what they found still makes my chest tight when I think about it. The tapes weren't just recordings. They contained hours upon hours of people's most intimate moments, conversations they'd had alone in their cars, phone calls they thought were private, even what seemed to be recordings of their dreams based on the sleep-talking and unconscious murmurs. 37 names on those tapes matched missing persons cases from Kentucky, Tennessee, and Indiana, spanning 4 decades. And while they never found bodies, they found something else. A second room behind the basement wall containing personal effects from each missing person, carefully preserved and labeled with those same catalog numbers. Paul never admitted to killing anyone, insisted during every interrogation that he was just an archivist, a keeper of stories that would otherwise be lost. But he also never explained how he got those recordings, or why Catherine Brennan's purse was in that hidden room with her driver's license still inside. They sent him to a federal facility for psychiatric evaluation, and Red Hollow tried to forget, but even now, 5 years later, sometimes late at night when I can't sleep, I swear I can still hear faint broadcasts coming through the walls. Voices I recognize describing moments that haven't happened yet, conversations that won't occur for days or weeks. And I wonder if Paul's equipment is still running somewhere, still recording, still waiting for the right frequency to tell everyone's secrets. The drive to Gladwin took me through miles of pine forests and forgotten highways, past rusted mailboxes and weathered barns that looked exactly like they did 35 years ago. My 42nd birthday had passed just last month, and returning to that house felt like walking backwards through time, each mile stripping away another year of carefully constructed distance. My family owned that property from 1989 to 1991, though nobody ever explained why we left so suddenly, why Dad took a pay cut to relocate us to Ohio, or why Mom would change the subject whenever I asked about our old place. The realtor had called me 3 weeks earlier. The current owners abandoned it, stopped paying taxes, and now it sat in foreclosure. Since my name was still on some old county records as a former resident, They wondered if I wanted first option to buy. I didn't want the house, but something pulled me back there. Some unfinished thread that had been tugging at me for decades. The property looked smaller than memory suggested, sitting on the wrong side of the railroad tracks that divided Gladwin between the respectable neighborhoods and places like ours. Paint peeled from the siding in long strips like dead skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect and Michigan winters. I parked my rental car beside a pile of rotting lumber someone had stacked against the garage 20 years ago, now home to possums and God knows what else. The key was under a fake rock near the steps, exactly where the realtor said it would be. Standing there with that cold metal in my palm, I remembered my younger sister Melody, how she used to clutch my arm when we walked up these same steps after school. She was 7 when we lived here, always talking about the thin man she saw at night, standing in the corner of our shared bedroom. Mom would smooth her hair, tell her it was just shadows from the streetlight, but Melody would shake her head so hard her pigtails would whip around, insisting he was real, that he watched us sleep. Inside, the house exhaled 30 years of dust and mildew, that particular smell of abandonment that gets into your throat and stays there. Faded wallpaper curled at the corners, revealing water stains that spread across the ceiling like diseased skin. I walked through the living room, my footsteps echoing on warped hardwood, remembering how Mom used to keep plastic covers on all the furniture, how Dad would sit in his recliner reading the paper, while pretending not to hear Melody crying upstairs about the thin man. The kitchen cabinets hung open, most of the doors missing, and someone had torn out the old avocado-colored appliances, leaving gaps like pulled teeth. But it was the hallway that made me pause, that narrow passage leading to the bedrooms where the air seemed thicker, heavier. The closet door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar, the same closet Melody refused to go near, the one she said the thin man came from. I pushed open our old bedroom door, hinges screaming against the silence, and found myself staring at that corner where Melody claimed he stood. The room felt wrong, too small, like the walls had crept inward over the years. Afternoon light filtered through filthy windows, casting long shadows across the floor, and I understood how a 7-year-old might see monsters in those dark angles. But then I noticed something that made me stop breathing for a moment. Scratch marks on the closet door frame, deep gouges in the wood that looked deliberate, desperate. I ran my fingers along them, feeling how they went deep into the grain, wondering if they'd always been there or if years of tenants had added their own marks. The closet itself was empty except for wire hangers that chimed softly when I opened the door wider, but the back wall looked different, newer than the rest, like someone had put up fresh drywall at some point. The drywall came apart easier than it should have, crumbling under pressure from my car key, revealing a narrow crawl space behind it that shouldn't exist according to the house's layout. The smell hit me first, stale air mixed with something organic, like old leather and mothballs. Using my phone's flashlight, I could see the space extended back about 4 feet, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. There were things in there, boxes and bundles wrapped in deteriorating plastic, all covered in decades of dust. I pulled out the nearest box, my shirt catching on exposed nails, and found it full of someone else's life. Photographs from the 60s, women in beehive hairdos and men in narrow ties, all smiling at backyard barbecues and holiday parties. At the bottom was a driver's license for someone named Gregory Fulton, issued in 1968. The plastic cracked, but the photo still visible. A man with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes that seemed to follow you no matter which angle you held it. More boxes revealed more pieces of the Fulton's life. Carolyn Fulton's nursing diploma from 1965, their wedding album, tax returns, even a collection of his wristwatch still ticking impossibly after all these years. Everything you'd never leave behind voluntarily. The last box contained something that made me pull my hand back, like I'd touched something hot. A child's dress, yellow with tiny daisies, folded carefully around a pair of small white shoes. Beneath that, newspaper clippings about the Fultons' disappearance in 1969, how they'd vanished one October night, leaving dinner half-eaten on the table, their car in the driveway, their door unlocked. The articles mentioned search parties, theories about mob connections, mental breakdown, but nothing conclusive. One piece, dated 6 months after they vanished, mentioned how the new owners reported strange incidents. Doors opening by themselves, shadows in the hallways, the feeling of being watched. Those owners lasted 8 months. I sat there on the dusty floor, surrounded by the Fultons' abandoned life, when I heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy boots, deliberate and slow, followed by a knock that echoed through the empty house. The sheriff stood at the door, a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a badge that had seen better days. He'd heard about someone poking around the old place, wanted to make sure I wasn't a squatter or scavenger. When I explained who I was, showed him my ID, told him about finding the Fultons' belongings, his expression changed from suspicious to something else, something that looked like resignation. He asked me to show him, and when he saw the hidden crawl space, the boxes spread across the bedroom floor, he just nodded like he'd been expecting this call for 40 years. "We knew they never left town," he said quietly, examining Gregory Fulton's license with gloved hands. "But we never found bodies, never found blood, never found anything that would tell us what happened that night." He helped me pull out the rest of the items, taking photos with his phone, making notes in a small notebook he kept pulling from his chest pocket. There were more newspaper clippings at the bottom of the last box, but these were different. Older articles from the 50s about missing persons in Gladwin County, at least 6 cases over 15 years, all from houses near the railroad tracks. The sheriff read them without comment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he wouldn't say. When we finished cataloging everything, he sat on the porch steps and lit a cigarette, even though I could tell he was trying to quit by the way he held it, guilty and necessary at the same time. "Every single owner after the Fultons left within a year," he said, smoke drifting between us. "Your family lasted 2 years, which was actually the longest. Most made it 6 months, maybe 8. They'd all say different things: electrical problems, job transfers, family issues. But when you pushed them, really pushed them, they'd mention the feelings, the sense that someone was always there, always watching." I asked him about Melody's thin man, half expecting him to laugh or dismiss it like my parents had. But his face went still, cigarette forgotten between his fingers. "Your sister wasn't the only one," he said after a long pause. "Kids from 3 different families described the same thing. A tall, thin figure standing in corners, always in the bedrooms, always at night. One boy, Jamie something, drew pictures of him over and over until his parents found them and burned the whole stack. The thing is, these families didn't know each other, never compared stories, but the descriptions were always identical. Tall, too tall for the ceiling, thin like he hadn't eaten in years, and just standing there, watching." The sheriff dropped his cigarette, crushing it under his boot with more force than necessary. He told me they'd investigated everything, checked for gas leaks that might cause hallucinations, tested for mold, even brought in a psychologist to examine the children. Nothing. No explanation for why multiple kids saw the same impossible figure in the same house across different years. The sheriff stood to leave, brushing dust from his uniform, but stopped at his patrol car and turned back. "There's something else," he said, voice lower now like he was sharing something he shouldn't. "About 10 years ago, we had a homeless man, Vietnam vet, who used to break into empty houses for shelter. One winter night, he broke into this place. We found him the next morning walking down Highway 61 in his underwear, middle of a snowstorm, feet bloody from walking on frozen ground. When we got him to the hospital, all he would say was that there was someone already living in the house, someone in the walls. He kept repeating, 'He's too tall for the rooms, too tall for the doors, but he fits in the spaces between.' The nurses sedated him, and when he woke up, he wouldn't talk about it anymore, just kept shaking whenever anyone mentioned that house. Checked himself out against medical advice and left town that same day. After the sheriff left, I stood alone in that house, the afternoon sun starting to fade, casting everything in that golden light that makes even decay look beautiful for a moment. I thought about calling Melody, asking her what she really remembered, but I knew she wouldn't talk about it. She'd spent years in therapy dealing with what our parents called night terrors, though she insisted until she was 15 that what she saw was real. I started gathering the Fultons' belongings, planning to take them to the sheriff's station, when I noticed something I'd missed before. In one of the photographs from their wedding album, there was a figure in the background standing behind the wedding party. Tall, elongated somehow, like the photo had been stretched in just that spot. It could have been a defect in the old film, a shadow, someone walking past when the shutter clicked. But the more I looked at other photos, the more I found him. At birthday parties, in windows, always at the edges, always slightly distorted like the camera couldn't quite capture what was there. I left everything for the sheriff to collect, walked out of that house and drove straight back to Ohio without stopping except for gas. 2 weeks later, the sheriff called to tell me they'd torn the house down, found nothing unusual in the walls or foundation, no bodies, no evidence of foul play. The Fultons were officially still missing. Case cold. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the demolition crew had complained about the layout being wrong. Rooms that didn't match the blueprint, spaces between walls that shouldn't exist in a house that size. They filled everything in with concrete before leveling it, built a small park where the house used to stand. Sometimes I'd drive past Gladwin on my way to other places, but I never stop. Melody and I don't talk about the house, but once during Christmas dinner last year, she'd had too much wine and said quietly, "He was too tall for the room, wasn't he?" That's what was wrong. He was too tall for any room. We changed the subject immediately, but I knew she still remembered, still saw him sometimes in her dreams, standing in corners that shouldn't exist, waiting in spaces between walls, too tall for any house but somehow always fitting perfectly in the places we don't look. "26 isn't exactly young anymore, but sitting here typing this out, my hands still get clammy remembering what happened when my buddy Jason and I were just 15. We lived in this forgettable town in Iowa, one of those places where the biggest news was usually about someone's dog getting loose or the high school football team losing another game. My parents ran a hardware store downtown, and Jason's dad worked at the grain elevator near the railroad tracks. That summer of 2012, we spent most nights playing video games in my basement, or hanging out at the gas station parking lot with other kids who had nothing better to do. Small town life was boring as hell, which is probably why we decided to sneak out that particular Thursday night in early August. Jason had been texting me all evening about how his older brother told him the park behind Miller Street was where kids went to smoke and drink without getting caught. Neither of us smoked or had access to beer, but the idea of being out past midnight felt rebellious enough for two sheltered kids like us. The park wasn't anything special, just a basketball court with bent rims, some rusty swings, a slide that had been repainted so many times you could peel the layers off like an onion, and a concrete restroom building that always smelled like piss and mildew. We climbed out my bedroom window around 12:30, using the oak tree beside the house that I'd been using as an escape route since I learned about it from a movie. The walk there took maybe 20 minutes through empty streets, past dark houses where everyone was sleeping like normal people do on weeknight. When we got to the park entrance, the first thing we noticed was this old sedan parked near the basketball court. Maybe a dark blue or black Ford from the early 2000s. Hard to tell the exact color in the darkness. The engine was running, but the headlights were completely off, which seemed weird even to our teenage brains. We could barely make out someone sitting in the driver's seat, just a shadow really, but definitely a man based on the size and shape. Jason grabbed my arm and whispered something about maybe we should leave, but I was trying to act tough. You know how kids are. So I yelled out, "Hey, everything okay over there?" Real loud. The reaction was immediate and violent. The engine roared. Tires squealed against the asphalt, leaving marks you could still see days later. And the car tore out of there so fast it almost clipped the fence post at the exit. We stood there for a good minute, our hearts pounding, trying to process what just happened. After the adrenaline wore off a bit, we actually laughed about it, making jokes about interrupting someone's drug deal or maybe catching someone cheating on their spouse. We walked over to the basketball court where the car had been parked, and Jason found a cigarette butt still smoldering on the ground. One of those menthol ones with the green ring around the filter. The smart thing would have been to leave right then, but we were 15 and thought we were invincible. So we stayed and headed over to the swings instead. The chains creaked like crazy when we sat down, that metallic groaning sound that echoes in empty spaces at night. We were there maybe 10 minutes talking about stupid stuff like whether Ashley from biology class liked Jason back, when I noticed movement near the restroom building about 30 feet away. The door to the men's room was cracked open maybe 6 inches, and there was someone standing behind it, watching us through the gap. At first I thought maybe it was just another teenager or someone who actually needed to use the bathroom, but then I saw the mask. It was one of those cheap plastic masks they sell at the county fair every year. The kind with the elastic band that always breaks. This one was supposed to be a wolf or maybe a dog, with fake fur glued around the edges that was peeling off in places. The person wearing it wasn't moving at all, just standing there perfectly still. And I could see their eyes through the holes, reflecting a little bit of light from the street lamp across the park. Jason followed my stare and went completely quiet mid-sentence, his whole body tensing up on the swing next to me. We sat there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, having this bizarre staring contest with someone in a discount Halloween mask hiding in a public bathroom. Jason was the first to move, standing up slowly from his swing and pulling out his phone to use as a flashlight. The second that beam hit the restroom door, whoever was behind it pulled back into the darkness, and we heard the door slam shut completely. Then nothing, no footsteps running away, no door opening again, just absolute silence, except for our own breathing and the distant sound of a train horn somewhere across town. We argued in harsh whispers about what to do, Jason wanting to run immediately while I insisted we should check if someone needed help. Maybe it was just some homeless person trying to sleep. Finally, we compromised and decided to walk past the restroom on our way out, staying far enough away to run if needed, but close enough to see if the door opened again. As we approached, keeping maybe 15 feet between us and the building, we could hear something that made my skin prickle, breathing, heavy and deliberate, coming from behind that closed door. Not like someone out of breath from running, but more like someone deliberately breathing loud enough for us to hear, almost like they wanted us to know they were still there. Jason had his phone recording video at this point, his hand visibly trembling in the screen's glow, and we speed-walked past without stopping. The moment we cleared the restroom, we heard the door creak open behind us, and both of us just bolted without looking back. We ran harder than I've ever run in my life, cutting through backyards, jumping fences, setting off motion sensor lights all over the neighborhood until we finally made it back to my house, gasping and covered in sweat. We stayed up the rest of the night in my room, doors locked, chairs propped against them like that would somehow help if someone really wanted to get in. Around 5 in the morning, when the sun was starting to come up and we finally felt somewhat safe again, Jason showed me the video he took. Most of it was just shaky darkness and our footsteps. But there was one frame, just one, where you could see the mask more clearly when we passed by. Behind the cheap plastic wolf face, the person was wearing what looked like medical scrubs, the light blue kind, and there was something dark stained on the front that could have been dirt, or could have been something much worse. We debated calling the police, but figured they'd just think we were making stuff up, or get us in trouble for sneaking out. So we kept quiet and agreed to never go back to that park again. The next morning, Friday, my mom was watching the local news while making breakfast when she called me downstairs, her voice all worried and strange. On the TV, there was a reporter standing in front of the same park we'd been at just hours before, yellow police tape everywhere, cops walking around with evidence bags. The reporter was saying something about suspicious items found near the restroom facility and increased patrols in the area. But what really got my attention was when they showed a shot of the basketball court. Right there on the screen, clear as day, were the tire marks from that sedan peeling out, and 2 officers were taking photos of them. My mom asked if I knew anything about it since the park was so close to Jason's house, and I just shrugged and said no, my mouth completely dry. Then my phone started buzzing with texts from Jason. His older brother had driven by the park on his way to work, and saw them pulling evidence out of the restroom, including a roll of duct tape, zip ties, and someone's cell phone that had been tossed behind the toilet. What happened next is what still keeps me up some nights, even after all these years. Jason's brother knew a guy who worked dispatch at the police station, and through that connection, we found out something that wasn't on the news. The police had pulled security footage from the gas station across from the park and from 2 different ATM cameras on Miller Street. According to what Jason's brother heard, the footage showed 2 teenage boys, us, entering the park at 12:53 in the morning. But here's the part that makes me want to throw up even now. It also showed that sedan following us from about 2 blocks away, headlights off the entire time, starting from when we first left my house. The driver had been watching us climb out my window, had followed us through the streets, and had gotten to the park just minutes before we did. But that wasn't even the worst part. The footage also showed the person in the mask had been there since 11:30, an hour before we even left my house, just waiting in that restroom. The security cameras caught them arriving in a different car, a white pickup truck with mud covering the license plate, carrying a backpack that they never brought back out. When the police searched more thoroughly, they found that backpack hidden in the ceiling tiles of the restroom. Inside were more zip ties, a knife, a bottle of chloroform that later tested positive for fingerprints from 3 different missing person cases in neighboring states, and a notebook with dates and locations, including my address and Jason's address circled multiple times. The person in the mask and the driver of the sedan were working together, and according to the timestamps on the footage, they had been communicating by text the whole time we were there, coordinating their positions around the park. The police never caught them. Both vehicles turned out to be stolen, taken from a used car lot 2 towns over earlier that week. The DNA evidence from the cigarette butt and the items in the backpack didn't match anything in the system. Jason and I had to give statements to the police, and our parents were obviously furious about us sneaking out. But that anger quickly turned to relief and then terror when they realized how close we'd come to something unimaginable. We found out later that there had been similar reports from 3 other towns within a 50-mile radius that summer. 2 teenagers or young people alone at night, suspicious vehicles, someone in a cheap mask, and abandoned items suggesting an attempted abduction. In one case from June, a girl actually went missing for 6 hours before managing to escape from a basement when her captors left to get food. She described 2 men, one tall and thin, one shorter and heavy, but trauma had affected her memory, and she couldn't give enough detail for a sketch. After our incident, the pattern stopped completely, like they knew the heat was on and just vanished. To this day, I triple-check my locks. I never go to parks at night, and whenever I see those cheap plastic masks at stores, I have to leave immediately. Jason moved away for college and never came back to town. We don't talk about that night anymore, but I know he thinks about it too. Especially when the news shows another story about someone who wasn't as lucky as we were. The security monitors in Building B showed nothing but empty hallways and loading docks, just like every other night since I'd started this maintenance supervisor gig 3 weeks ago. Outside, October wind rattled the metal siding of the industrial complex. 5 concrete giants that squatted on the old entrance to the St. Alder coal mine like tombstones, marking where the town's prosperity had died. My thermos of coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I kept sipping it anyway while reviewing the checklist for tonight's rounds. Replace the ballast in the warehouse's south corner, check the leak in Building D's roof, test the emergency exits in the plastics factory. Simple stuff that kept me from thinking too much about why I was back in Ridgemont after swearing I'd never set foot in Pennsylvania again. The divorce had been finalized last month. Baltimore felt like a different lifetime, and here I was, 34, and starting over in the same place I'd started from. By midnight, I'd already handled the urgent repairs and was doing my second walkthrough of Building C when I heard it for the first time. A rhythmic clanging, metal on metal, coming from somewhere beneath the concrete floor. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds before stopping, faint enough that I almost convinced myself it was just the old heating pipes expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. These buildings were constructed in the 70s, all of them rushing to cover the mine entrance after what happened in 1952. So weird noises were part of the package. I made a note in my log about checking the basement mechanical room tomorrow night and continued my rounds, but the sound stuck with me. There was something deliberate about the rhythm. 3 quick strikes, then a pause, then 3 more, like someone signaling rather than random pipe noise. Still, I'd learned not to let my imagination run wild during these long nights alone. That was a quick way to make yourself paranoid in empty buildings, where every shadow seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at it. The following week, the sounds became impossible to ignore. They started around 11 each night, always the same pattern but from different spots beneath Building C's floor, as if whatever was making them was moving through some kind of tunnel system below. I'd checked the basement 3 times already, crawling through the mechanical room with my flashlight, inspecting every pipe joint and valve, but found nothing out of place. The building's original blueprints, which I'd dug out of a filing cabinet in the main office, showed only a standard basement layout. No sub-basements, no access tunnels, nothing that would explain the sounds that were now accompanied by what I could only describe as muffled voices, too distorted to make out words, but definitely human in cadence. When I mentioned it casually to Tony, the day shift supervisor who'd been working the complex for 15 years, he just shrugged and said the place had always been noisy, especially Building C. Something about the way the wind hit it just right. What really got under my skin wasn't the sounds themselves, but the fact that they followed a schedule. Every night at 11, continuing until around 2 in the morning, then complete silence. I started bringing a digital recorder, trying to capture evidence that I wasn't losing my mind, but the playback only picked up faint static and the hum of the ventilation system. On Wednesday night, I decided to stay in Building C's basement during the active hours, sitting on an overturned bucket next to the boiler, with every light on and my phone recording video. At exactly 11, the clanging started, so close I could feel the vibrations through my boots. But this time I noticed something else. A draft of cold air that shouldn't exist in a sealed basement, coming from behind a section of wall covered by a massive industrial shelf unit loaded with old paint cans and cleaning supplies. The shelf must have weighed 800 pounds, but I could see gaps in the dust pattern on the floor, drag marks barely visible, like someone had moved it recently and tried to put it back exactly where it had been. It took me 3 nights to work up the courage and find the right equipment to move that shelf. I borrowed a furniture dolly from the loading dock and waited until Friday, when I knew the weekend security guard, Frank, would be doing his rounds at the other end of the complex. Inch by inch, I leveraged the shelf away from the wall, paint cans rattling with each pull, until I exposed what was hidden behind it. A freight elevator door, painted the same industrial beige as the walls, but with the unmistakable outline of the sliding gates. The manufacturer's plate was still visible, barely. Westinghouse freight elevator, Model F4, installed 1951. According to every blueprint and planning document I'd found, this elevator didn't exist. The control panel was dead, no power running to it, but the manual release lever on the gate still worked. And when I pulled it, the doors scraped open to reveal a shaft that descended into absolute darkness. The air that rushed up smelled wrong, not just stale or moldy, but sharp with something chemical that made my throat burn. The smart thing would have been to close those doors, push the shelf back, and pretend I'd never found it. Instead, I went back to my office and grabbed every flashlight I could find, plus the 100-foot rope from the emergency kit. The elevator car itself was stuck about 20 feet down the shaft, its roof accessible by a maintenance ladder bolted to the wall. When I climbed down and dropped onto the car's roof, my flashlight beam caught something that made me stop breathing for a second. The hatch was already open, and inside the car were hard hats, at least a dozen of them, arranged in a perfect circle on the floor. Each helmet had a carbide lamp attached, the old kind miners used before battery-powered lights, and in the center of the circle sat a leather-bound logbook, its pages swollen with moisture but still readable. The first entry was dated May 15, 1952, just 2 days before the mine supposedly collapsed, and it was written in pencil. Foreman Briggs ordered us to stay. Says the company will make it right. We can hear them drilling the seal already. I sat there in that elevator car for what felt like hours, reading through the logbook by flashlight, each entry more horrifying than the last. May 16th. 23 of us down here. Briggs says the benzene leak from the new chemical plant topside is worse than they thought. Company can't afford the cleanup if the state finds out. Cheaper to seal us in and claim cave-in. May the 17th. They cut the phone lines. Eddie tried to climb the shaft, but they'd already started pouring concrete at level 2. We can hear it setting above us. May the 18th. Air's getting thin. Briggs distributed the remaining water. Says we need to make it look real for when they eventually dig us out. Some of the men are talking about using the dynamite we have left. The entries became shorter, more desperate. May 20th. 16 still breathing. Decided to try the old shaft on the east side. If you find this, know that Allegheny Chemical Corporation murdered us. The final entry was different, written in shaky handwriting. May 22nd, I'm the last one. The others went deeper, looking for the ventilation shaft that connects to Baker's farm. I stayed because someone needs to witness this. The benzene is pooling at level 3. They'll build right on top of us and no one will ever know. My name is Joseph Garrett. I have a wife named Ruth and 2 boys. Tell them I tried to come home. Below that, in different ink that looked much fresher, someone had written a single line, "We're still here." The temperature in the elevator suddenly dropped so fast I could see my breath, and from somewhere far below came that familiar clanging sound, except now I understood what it was. Mining tools on rock, the sound of men still trying to dig their way out. That's when the elevator car lurched just a few inches, but enough to make me scramble for the ladder. The cables above groaned like they were supporting weight they hadn't held in decades, and I could hear something else now, something that sounded impossibly like footsteps on the rungs below me, climbing up from the depths of the shaft. I've never climbed anything so fast in my life. My flashlight bounced wildly as I hauled myself up those rungs, not daring to look down, the sound of those footsteps getting closer with each second. When I reached the basement floor, I grabbed the logbook and 2 of the helmets without thinking, then slammed the elevator gates shut and engaged the manual lock. The clanging from below became frantic, like dozens of pickaxes striking metal simultaneously, and the whole building seemed to vibrate with the force of it. I dragged that shelf back into place using strength I didn't know I had, my mind racing with the implications of what I'd found. 23 men, sealed underground with toxic chemicals, erased from history and replaced with a story about a mining accident. The next morning, I drove straight to the county records office and spent 6 hours searching through death certificates from 1952. There was no Joseph Garrett, no mining accident in May. The St. Alder mine officially closed in March of 1952 for economic reasons, 2 months before those logbook entries were written. I tried calling the State Environmental Agency, the Historical Society, even a journalist friend in Philadelphia, but every conversation ended the same way. They needed proof beyond an old logbook, something concrete that couldn't be dismissed as a hoax. So I went back the next night, armed with a crowbar and my phone to take pictures of everything. But when I moved the shelf again, the elevator doors opened to solid concrete. Not old concrete either. This was fresh, maybe a day old at most, still slightly damp to the touch. Someone had filled the entire shaft while I was gone, working fast enough to complete it in less than 24 hours. The only evidence I had left was the logbook and those 2 helmets I'd grabbed, but when I got back to my office, they were gone from my desk. In their place was a typed note. "Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. Your final check will be mailed. Do not return to the property." It was unsigned, but underneath someone had written in pencil, "Some things need to stay buried." The check arrived a week later, 3 times what they owed me, along with a non-disclosure agreement and a letter from a law firm I'd never heard of, stating that any discussion of alleged historical incidents related to the industrial complex would result in legal action. I didn't sign it. Instead, I spent the next month researching Allegheny Chemical Corporation, which had merged with two other companies in the 60s and eventually became part of a multinational conglomerate that still operated facilities across Pennsylvania. Every thread I pulled led to sealed records, lost documents, or people who suddenly didn't want to talk after making a few phone calls. An old-timer at the library, who'd worked in the mines as a young man, pulled me aside one afternoon and told me that everyone knew something had happened at St. Alder, but the families had been paid off or threatened into silence, and those who'd tried to speak up over the years had a tendency to have accidents or simply leave town without warning. I live in Montana now, working construction, trying to put distance between myself and whatever I stirred up that night in Building C. But sometimes, usually around 11 at night, I think about those 23 men and wonder if they're still down there, still digging, still hoping someone will hear them. Last month, I got an email from a blocked address with a single attachment, a newspaper clipping from 1952, about a benzene leak at a chemical plant in Pennsylvania that killed 3 workers and contaminated the groundwater. The article mentions an emergency cleanup supervised by Allegheny Chemical Corporation and notes that the incident was fully resolved with no lasting environmental impact. But there's a detail that wasn't in any of my research. The plant was built directly over the sealed St. Alder mine, using the old shaft as a waste disposal system. The email had no text, just the article and a photo taken recently, showing Building C of the industrial complex. In the basement window, barely visible, someone had traced words in what looked like coal dust. Still here. I deleted the email, changed my phone number, and stopped looking back. Some truths aren't meant to surface, and some voices, no matter how desperate, are better left unheard. Arizona in July feels like standing inside an oven, and visiting my cousin Brett during peak summer wasn't my brightest idea. College in California had just wrapped up for me, and instead of heading home to surf and sleep, I drove 12 hours through the desert to spend a week with him. Brett had been doing ranger work for a couple years, out in this desolate stretch near the Superstition Mountains, living in a cabin that felt more like an outpost on Mars than anywhere in America. Just turned 21 that spring, and here I was sweating through my shirt before noon, wondering why Brett chose this life over literally any other job. His place sat 3 miles from the nearest paved road, surrounded by nothing but scorched earth, towering saguaros, and these massive red rock formations that looked older than time itself. When I pulled up that Sunday afternoon, Brett came out to greet me, but something was different about him. He kept his eyes moving constantly, checking the ridgeline, the wash behind his cabin, even glancing at the sky like he expected something to drop from it. We sat on his porch that first evening, drinking lukewarm beer while the coyotes started their nightly chorus, and he barely said 10 words. Monday afternoon, Brett finally loosened up enough to suggest showing me around his territory. Around 4 o'clock, when the sun had shifted enough to create some shade in the canyons, he mentioned Trail 14, said it was one of the quieter routes that most tourists never found, winding through a narrow canyon to reach some abandoned mining equipment from way back. The trailhead sat right behind his cabin, just a wooden post with a carved number 14 that looked ready to fall over. Brett loaded his pack with more gear than seemed necessary for a short hike. Extra water, first aid kit, his radio, and his service weapon, which he checked twice before holstering. The path started easy enough, cutting between tall stands of Palo Verde trees before descending into the canyon proper. After about 40 minutes of hiking, the walls rose up around us, red stone towering maybe 60 feet overhead, and the temperature dropped enough that I stopped sweating for the first time all day. Brett led us toward what he called Skeleton Creek, explaining it hadn't seen water in almost a decade. We rounded a bend where the creek bed widened into a flat area scattered with white stones, and that's when we both stopped dead. Right in the middle of the wash was a javelina, its body parts arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, each piece placed with the kind of care that made bile rise in my throat. Brett pulled out his radio immediately but hesitated before calling it in. He walked around the carcass in a wide circle, taking photos with his phone, his jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles working. The spiral was maybe 6 feet across, with the head placed dead center, eyes somehow still intact and staring straight up at the narrow strip of sky between the canyon walls. Each leg had been separated at the joint and positioned to create the spiral arms, with smaller pieces filling in the gaps. No blood pool underneath, which meant it had been killed somewhere else and brought here. Brett muttered something about this being the third one this month, then told me to step back while he documented everything. The smell hit me then, not just death, but something chemical underneath it, like formaldehyde mixed with sage. Brett noticed it too, covering his nose with his sleeve while he worked. He pointed to the ground around the spiral where someone had swept the sand smooth, erasing any footprints except for our own. We kept hiking after Brett called it in to the main station, though neither of us talked much. Another 20 minutes up the trail, we found the second one. A coyote this time, arranged in a perfect triangle near a cluster of barrel cacti. Then a rattlesnake about 10 minutes later, its body parts forming a pentagon on a flat rock that jutted out from the canyon wall. Each arrangement was different but equally precise, like someone had used a measuring tape and protractor to get the angles right. Brett's radio crackled with responses from the station, but the static was so bad in the canyon that we could barely make out what they were saying. The sun was getting low, painting the canyon walls this deep orange color that would have been beautiful if we weren't finding mutilated animals every few hundred yards. By the time we reached the old mining site at the trail's end, we'd counted 7 different arrangements, each one more elaborate than the last. The final one made us both stop breathing for a second. A desert bighorn sheep, massive thing that must have weighed 200 pounds. Its parts arranged in a complex pattern that looked almost like a star chart or constellation map. Brett took more photos while I tried not to vomit, the combination of heat and that chemical smell making my head spin. He showed me something I hadn't noticed at first. Small symbols carved into the rocks near each arrangement. These weird interconnected circles with lines radiating outward. Some had been filled in with what looked like charcoal or ash, making them stand out against the red stone. The mining site itself was just rusted equipment and a collapsed shaft entrance, but Brett found more symbols carved into the wooden beams that still stood. He traced one with his finger, then jerked his hand back like it had shocked him. When I asked what was wrong, he just shook his head and said we needed to leave before dark. The hike back felt twice as long, with shadows stretching across the trail and every sound making us both jump. Brett kept checking behind us, his hand hovering near his weapon, and I caught myself doing the same thing even though I had no idea what we were watching for. We passed the arrangements again, and in the dying light, they looked different somehow. More deliberate, like they were pointing towards something or marking a path we couldn't see. We made it back to Brett's cabin just as full dark hit, and he immediately locked both doors and checked all the windows, something I'd never seen him do the night before. He poured us each 3 fingers of whiskey, his hands not quite steady, and finally started talking about the other incidents. First one had been a month ago, just a single rabbit arranged in a perfect square near Trail 7. Then 2 weeks later, 3 arrangements on Trail 10. Last week, 5 on Trail 3. Always increasing, always more complex, and always on trails that led deeper into the canyon system. The local sheriff's department had been out twice but found nothing except the carcasses, no tracks or evidence of who might be doing it. Brett had his own theory though. He'd noticed someone had been camping illegally somewhere in the park, finding traces of fire pits that had been carefully covered, makeshift shelters that had been torn down, and footprints in places where no hiker should be. Whoever it was knew the area well, maybe better than the rangers did, and they were getting bolder with each passing week. Around midnight, we were both still awake, Brett cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table while I pretended to read a book, but really just stared at the same page. That's when we heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. Brett held up his hand for me to stay quiet, then moved to the window, keeping to the side so he couldn't be seen from outside. The footsteps continued, sometimes stopping right outside a window for 30 seconds or more before moving on. Then came this sound I'll never forget. Fingernails or something sharp dragging across the wooden walls, starting at the front door and moving all the way around to the back. Brett had his rifle ready, but when he finally looked outside with a flashlight, nobody was there. Just our two vehicles parked where we'd left them, and the endless darkness of the desert beyond. The smell hit us when Brett cracked open the back door to check the porch. That same chemical stench from the canyon mixed with fresh-turned earth, and something else, something organic and wrong. There were no footprints in the dirt, which made no sense given how clearly we'd heard someone walking on the gravel. Brett called it in to dispatch, but they said all units were tied up with some emergency in town and couldn't send anyone until morning. We spent the rest of the night taking shifts, one of us always awake and watching while the other tried to sleep on the couch. Every hour or so we'd hear something, a branch snapping too close to the cabin, what sounded like whispered voices from somewhere in the darkness, or that dragging sound against the walls again. Around 3 in the morning, I was on watch when I saw something that made every hair on my body stand up. Through the kitchen window, barely visible in the moonlight, someone was standing at the edge of the clearing where the desert began. They weren't moving, just standing there facing the cabin, too far away to make out any features, but close enough that I knew they were watching us. I grabbed Brett, but by the time he got to the window, whoever it was had vanished. We found something in the morning, though, a patch of disturbed earth about 50 feet from the cabin where someone had been digging. The hole maybe 3 feet deep and perfectly rectangular, with that same awful smell rising from it. Sheriff's Department finally showed up around 9 that morning, 2 deputies who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Brett led them to the hole first, and I watched their expressions change from bored to concerned when they saw how precise the edges were, like someone had used a framing square to get perfect 90-degree angles. One deputy took photos while the other walked the perimeter, finding more disturbed areas we'd missed in our exhaustion. Smaller holes arranged in a pattern that formed a half circle around the back of the cabin. They called for backup and a forensic team, suddenly taking everything very seriously. While we waited, Brett showed them photos from the trail, and one of the deputies recognized the symbols carved in the rocks. Said they'd found similar markings at an abandoned homestead about 15 miles north, where some squatters had been living illegally for months before disappearing 2 weeks ago. The forensic team arrived in the afternoon with metal detectors and excavation equipment, and what they found in those holes changed everything. Animal bones, hundreds of them, sorted by type and wrapped in cloth that reeked of that chemical smell. But underneath those, they found notebooks wrapped in plastic, pages filled with detailed observations about every ranger in the park, their schedules, their routes, even personal details like what they ate for lunch. My name was in there too, written just days before I'd arrived, with a note that said, "Visitor coming, young male, relationship to Ranger Howell unknown, surveillance priority high." Brett went pale reading that, realizing someone had been watching him long enough to know I was coming before he'd told anyone at work. The notebooks contained maps of every trail in the park, marked with times and dates of ranger patrols, hiker traffic patterns, and these strange symbols at specific locations. One map showed Trail 14 with 7 marks, exactly where we'd found the animal arrangements. But there were marks on other trails too, dozens of them, some with dates listed for the coming weeks. The detective in charge, a woman named Rodriguez who'd driven down from Phoenix, said it looked like someone was documenting the park for something bigger, maybe planning something they hadn't carried out yet. She had Brett and the other rangers evacuate all the remote cabins that night, moving everyone to the main ranger station in town. They found the camp the next morning, hidden in a box canyon that wasn't on any official trail maps. 3 military-style tents, supplies for months, and more notebooks filled with observations going back 2 years. What really got to everyone was the final notebook they recovered, the one that had been left open on a makeshift desk, made from stacked rocks and a piece of plywood. The handwriting was different from the others, more frantic and deteriorating as the pages went on, like someone writing while losing their grip on reality. It documented the daily movements of every ranger down to the minute, but toward the end, the entries became stranger. References to the pattern being complete, the land demanding its tribute, and detailed descriptions of rituals that needed to be performed at specific coordinates. The last entry, written just 2 days before we found those arrangements on Trail 14, was the worst. It described Brett and me by name, said we would walk the trail as planned, that we would find what had been prepared, and then just one line at the bottom. They walked the trail every night. Below that, nothing but coordinates, hundreds of them, covering 3 pages, each one corresponding to a location in the park. Detective Rodriguez had a team check the first few coordinates and found more animal arrangements at each one, some fresh, others weeks old, all arranged in those same geometric patterns. They never found whoever had been living in that camp. The forensic team determined at least 3 different people had been there based on DNA evidence, but none matched anyone in the system. The only lead came from a gas station security camera in town that caught 3 figures in dark clothing buying supplies 6 weeks earlier, their faces carefully turned away from the camera, moving in this synchronized way that made my skin prickle just watching the footage. Brett took leave after that, couldn't handle going back to the cabin knowing someone had been watching him for years. I cut my visit short, drove straight back to California without stopping except for gas. The Park Service closed that section for 6 months, said it was for maintenance and ecological survey, but Brett told me they brought in federal investigators and found more camps, more arrangements, more evidence of long-term surveillance of isolated government facilities across 3 states. I still have nightmares about that figure standing at the edge of the clearing, and sometimes I wake up certain I can smell that chemical stench, that mix of death and earth and something else. Brett's working in Colorado now, an office job with the Forest Service. Says he's done with remote assignments. He sent me a news article last month about hikers finding animal arrangements in the Rockies. Same geometric patterns, same symbols carved in the rocks. The article didn't mention the notebooks they found, but Brett heard through his contacts. Same handwriting, same detailed surveillance, and at the bottom of the last page, those same 5 words that keep me awake some nights. They walk the trail every night. The oil fields of Midland County paid better than anything else a 23-year-old dropout could find in West Texas, and that's how I ended up sharing cheap beers with Curtis most nights after our shifts. He rented this weathered 2-story place just off Route 19, about 15 minutes from the drilling sites, where the desert stretched endlessly in every direction, and the nearest neighbor lived a quarter mile away. Curtis had been there 6 months when I started coming around in September of 2022, and the house already looked like it had been abandoned for years. Peeling yellow paint, warped wooden siding, and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. But the rent was dirt cheap. He had a massive TV, and after 12 hours of wrestling with drilling equipment under the scorching sun, neither of us cared much about aesthetics. We'd sink into his torn leather couch, crack open a case of Lone Star, and drink until our bodies stopped aching and the room started spinning. That particular night in late September started like any other. We'd polished off most of a bottle of Jim Beam between us, chasing it with beer after beer while watching old westerns on his ancient plasma screen. The house creaked and groaned around us the way old houses do. But around 11 that night, something different started. It was this soft, deliberate knocking sound, 3 taps at a time, coming from somewhere inside the wall behind the TV. Curtis just laughed it off, slurring something about the ancient plumbing in these old houses, how the pipes knocked when the temperature dropped at night. But these weren't random clanking sounds. They had a rhythm, a pattern, like someone signaling from inside the walls. Then we heard footsteps directly above us, slow and measured, crossing from one end of the ceiling to the other. Curtis went quiet for a moment, then grabbed another beer and cranked up the volume on the TV, but I could still hear those footsteps pacing back and forth right above our heads, right? The next few nights followed the exact same pattern. We'd drink ourselves stupid, And right around 11:11, those 3 knocks would start up again, always from that same spot in the wall. The footsteps would follow minutes later, sometimes stopping directly above wherever we were sitting, like whoever was up there knew exactly where to stand. Curtis kept insisting it was nothing, said the previous tenants probably had the same issue, that old houses in Texas settle weird when the foundation shifts from the heat. But drunk as I was, I started noticing other things he seemed determined to ignore. The back door would be unlocked in the morning when we'd definitely locked it the night before. Empty beer cans we'd left on the coffee table would be lined up neatly on the kitchen counter. Once I found my work boots placed perfectly parallel by the front door when I knew I'd kicked them off in different corners of the room. Curtis always had an explanation. We were too drunk to remember. Maybe we cleaned up and forgot. Typical blackout behavior. By the 4th night, even Curtis couldn't pretend anymore. We were both sprawled on the couch, less drunk than usual because we'd run out of whiskey, when the knocks started early, around 10:30 instead of 11:11. This time they came from multiple walls at once, surrounding us with that same deliberate 3-tap pattern, like Morse code we couldn't decipher. The footsteps upstairs turned into running, heavy boots sprinting from one end of the attic to the other, making the ceiling fan shake and dust drift down onto our faces. Curtis jumped up, grabbed a baseball bat from behind the door and headed for the stairs, shouting that whoever was up there better get the hell out of his house. I followed him up those narrow wooden steps, using my phone's flashlight since the stairway bulb had been dead for months. The attic door was one of those pull-down types with a ladder, and it was already halfway open. The ladder extended just enough for someone to squeeze through. Curtis yanked it all the way down and climbed up while I held the bat, ready to swing at whoever came running out. The stench hit us first. Stale cigarette smoke mixed with something sour, like unwashed clothes left to rot in summer heat. Curtis pulled himself up into the darkness while I climbed up behind him, and when he found the pull string for the single bare bulb, what we saw made us both go completely silent. There was a makeshift living space set up in the corner, a stained twin mattress pushed against the wall, surrounded by dozens of crushed beer cans and cigarette butts, some still smoldering in an old coffee tin. Food wrappers from the gas station down the road were scattered everywhere, some dated from just days ago. But what made my throat close up were the photographs spread across the mattress like playing cards. Polaroids, maybe 30 or 40 of them, all showing Curtis and me passed out on the couch downstairs. Different nights, different positions, but always unconscious, always vulnerable. In some photos, a shadow fell across our faces, like whoever took them was standing directly over us. One showed Curtis with his mouth hanging open, a hand reaching into frame holding what looked like a piece of beef jerky inches from his lips. Curtis started cursing, kicking at the mattress, sending photos scattering across the plywood floor. That's when we noticed the holes drilled through the ceiling, perfect little spy holes positioned right above the living room, the kitchen, even one that looked down into the bathroom. Whoever had been living up here had been watching everything, documenting our routines, learning when we drank ourselves unconscious. I grabbed a handful of the photos, noticing some were dated on the back in neat handwriting. They went back 2 months, long before I'd started coming over. There were pictures of Curtis alone, eating dinner, watching TV, even one of him stepping out of the shower, taken from above through that bathroom hole. The most recent photo, dated just 2 days ago, showed both of us on the couch, and someone had drawn little X marks over our eyes with a red pen. Curtis found an old army duffel bag shoved behind the mattress, still packed with clothes, a toiletry kit, and disturbingly, a worn leather journal filled with observations about our schedules, when we left for work, when we came home, how much we typically drank before passing out. We practically fell down that ladder trying to get out of the attic, Curtis already on his phone with 911 while I ran through the house checking closets, behind doors, anywhere someone could hide. The operator told us to get out of the house immediately and wait for the sheriff's department, but Curtis was beyond reasoning. He grabbed his shotgun from the bedroom closet and started shooting the locks off every door in the house, screaming for whoever it was to show themselves. I dragged him outside just as 2 sheriff's cars pulled up, their lights painting the desert red and blue. The deputies searched the house top to bottom while we sat in the back of a patrol car, sobering up fast as the reality sank in. They found more evidence we'd missed: empty food containers hidden in the wall cavity behind the TV where those knocks had been coming from, and a bucket in the corner of the attic that explained the sour smell. Whoever it was had been relieving themselves up there, probably for weeks, only leaving when they knew we'd be at work. The deputy who took our statements, an older guy with deep-set wrinkles around his eyes, said they'd seen this before with the transient population that follows oil work from town to town. Sometimes they find an empty house. Sometimes they find one with people too drunk to notice an extra resident. He showed us something else they found: a crude map drawn on notebook paper, showing the house layout, our work schedules written in the margins, and a note that said, "Thursday night, heavy drinking, dead to the world by midnight." That was tonight. The deputy speculated our uninvited guest had probably been entering through the attic's external access panel, the one hidden behind the massive oak tree in the backyard that neither of us had ever thought to check. They found fresh scratches on the panel's lock and boot prints in the dirt below, leading off into the mesquite brush. Curtis asked if they could track whoever it was, but the deputy just shook his head. With miles of desert in every direction and abandoned houses scattered all along Route 19, the person could be anywhere by now. Curtis couldn't stay in that house another night. He packed everything he could fit in his truck and crashed at my motel room near the drilling site. We went back the next morning with 3 other guys from our crew to get the rest of his stuff, and that's when we found something the deputies had missed. Hidden under the insulation in the attic, wrapped in plastic, was a roll of film negatives. When we held them up to the light, they showed other people, other houses, all shot from similar angles through ceilings and walls. Some of the photos had addresses written on the edges, places scattered across West Texas, going back years. One set of photos from Odessa showed a family eating dinner, completely unaware of the camera above them. Another from Pecos showed an elderly man in his bedroom, and in the last photo of that series, the same man was lying very still on the floor, his face turned away from the camera. Curtis turned white when he recognized one of the addresses. It was a house 2 streets over where his cousin lived until last year, when she suddenly moved back to Houston, claiming she never felt safe there, but could never explain why. The investigation went nowhere fast. The sheriff's department took all the evidence, said they'd check with other counties about similar cases, but nothing ever came of it. Curtis moved out that same week, found a studio apartment closer to town with proper locks and neighbors close enough to hear if something went wrong. About a month later, I ran into the property manager at the gas station, and he mentioned they'd found similar setups in 2 other rental houses along Route 19. Same kind of mattress in the attic, same holes drilled through the ceiling, but no photographs left behind. He said they were installing motion sensors and cameras in all their properties, but something about his nervous laugh told me he didn't think it would help much. The worst part came 3 weeks after that, when Curtis called me at 2 in the morning, his voice shaking. He'd developed some of his own photos from a disposable camera he'd forgotten about, pictures from a barbecue at his old house a month before the knocking started. In the background of one photo, barely visible in the upstairs window, was the silhouette of someone standing in what should have been an empty attic, just watching. I quit drinking after that. Not completely, but those blackout nights were done for good. The thought of lying there unconscious while someone stood over me, maybe touching my things, maybe touching me, was enough to keep me stone sober most nights. Curtis lasted another 2 months in Texas before taking a job in North Dakota. Said the money wasn't worth looking over his shoulder every time he heard a floorboard creak. Before he left, we drove out to the house on Route 19 one last time, middle of the day with the sun blazing overhead. The place was already being renovated, workers tearing out walls and replacing the ceiling. But when we talked to the foreman, he pulled us aside and showed us something they'd found. Behind the drywall in the master bedroom, they'd discovered a narrow crawl space just wide enough for someone thin to shimmy through, connecting every room in the house. Inside were more photographs, hundreds of them, some so old they'd yellowed and cracked. Different decades, different families, all living their lives while someone moved through their walls like a ghost. The foreman said they'd found similar passages in 3 other houses being renovated along Route 19, all built by the same contractor back in the 60s. I still work the oil fields, but I live in a newer apartment complex now. 3rd floor with a single entrance and windows that face the parking lot, where there's always someone coming or going. Sometimes at night, when I hear the normal sounds of an apartment building, footsteps from upstairs, pipes gurgling in the walls, I have to remind myself that these are just my neighbors living their lives. But I check my locks 3 times before bed, and I've got a security camera that uploads to the cloud, recording everything while I sleep. The sheriff's department never caught anyone, and eventually the case files got buried under newer problems. Every few months, Curtis texts me a link to some news story from a small Texas town. Another house, another attic, another set of photographs left behind. We don't talk about it directly, but we both know it's the same person, still out there, still moving through the empty spaces where people never think to look. What haunts me most is wondering how many times we sat there, drunk and laughing at the TV, while someone stood perfectly still just inches away behind the drywall, breathing shallow breaths, waiting for us to pass out so they could come out and document our unconscious bodies for reasons I'll never understand and don't want to. It happened a few years ago when my fiancé and I had just moved into a quiet neighborhood in Oregon called Pine Ridge. It was one of those places where everyone waved at each other, and the biggest concern was who left their trash bins out too long. We had a golden retriever named Daisy, a goofy, gentle dog who loved chasing leaves and barking at sprinklers. Our house backed up against a stretch of woods, crisscrossed by narrow trails that locals used for walks. We went there almost every evening after dinner, Daisy trotting ahead with her tail wagging, nose buried in every patch of grass. That trail became part of our routine, something small that made the days feel peaceful. One afternoon around sunset, Daisy darted into the trees chasing what looked like a squirrel. Normally she would come back after a few minutes panting and proud, but that day she didn't. We called her name until it got dark, our flashlights cutting through the trees like thin blades of light. No collar jingling, no rustling, no bark. It was as if she had evaporated between the pines. That night we barely slept. The woods that had once felt calm now pressed against the house like a living thing, too quiet, too dark. Every creak of the porch made my chest tighten. For the next several days, we searched. We put up flyers, left bowls of food along the trails, and talked to neighbors. Some joined us in the search, bringing lanterns and walking the paths at dusk. I remember the cold dampness that clung to my jeans and the way the trees seemed to absorb our voices. A man named Curtis, who lived 2 streets over, said he had seen a light deep in the woods the night Daisy disappeared, like someone walking with a headlamp. We thought maybe it was just another neighbor helping out. Still, something about how he said it lingered in my mind, like a small splinter I couldn't ignore. By the 5th night, exhaustion had settled in. My fiancé had to work early the next morning, so I stayed up alone, scrolling through local lost pet groups online. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Around midnight, I heard it, faint scratching at the front door. At first, I thought I imagined it, but it came again, slow, deliberate, and too high to be from the wind. My heart pounded as I walked toward the door. I remember thinking, please let it be Daisy. When I opened the door, the porch light flickered once before staying on. There was no sign of Daisy, no sound, no movement, just her collar, lying perfectly centered on the doormat. The tag still had her name etched into it, and when I picked it up, it was warm, like it had just come off her neck. The air felt heavy, and for a long moment I couldn't breathe properly. I called my fiancé, my voice trembling, but he didn't pick up. I kept staring at the collar, half expecting someone to step out from the shadows and explain what I was looking at. When he got home, we checked the doorbell camera together. The footage showed a man approaching our porch around midnight. He wore a dark jacket and a headlamp that cast a wide beam of light across the camera lens, making it impossible to see his face. He moved slowly, almost carefully, like he didn't want to make noise. Then he placed Daisy's collar on the doormat, adjusted it so it was perfectly straight, leaned closer to the door, and whispered something. The microphone barely caught it, just a few muffled words. We replayed it several times before we could make out the phrase, "You should not have called the sheriff." My fiance's face went pale. Earlier that day, out of frustration, he had reported Daisy's disappearance to the local sheriff's office. It wasn't a big town, so everyone knew about it within hours. We had no enemies, no strange encounters, no reason anyone would care about our dog. But someone clearly did. The realization that a stranger had been standing right outside our door while we slept hit harder than anything. The thought made the house feel smaller, every window too exposed, every sound suspicious. We locked every door, pulled the curtains shut, and sat in silence for what felt like hours. The next morning, we handed the footage to the sheriff's deputy. He promised to look into it, though his tone made it sound like he didn't expect much. We went back to the woods that day, walking the same trails again, but it felt different now. Not just sad, but watched. The trees were still and the ground was soft from rain, yet we saw fresh boot prints that weren't ours. Bigger, heavier. They led in circles near the back fence of our neighborhood, looping again and again before stopping abruptly near one of the food bowls we had left for Daisy. The bowl was empty, but the ground around it looked like someone had knelt there for a long time. That night, neither of us could relax. Every creak in the walls made us glance toward the door. Around 1 in the morning, a light flashed across the living room curtains, just once, like a quick sweep from a flashlight. We sat there frozen in place, listening, waiting for footsteps, for anything. But after a few minutes, the silence returned. When we finally worked up the courage to check outside, there was nothing. The street was empty, and the trees behind the house swayed gently under the wind. It was almost worse that way, knowing someone could be out there and not seeing them. Over the next week, we stayed with my fiance's sister in town. When we returned home, the sheriff's department had left a note saying they had no further leads. We tried to move on, but small things kept happening. One morning, the latch on our backyard gate was open. Another day, our porch light was unscrewed halfway, just enough to make it flicker. We bought new locks, new cameras, and motion lights, but the unease never really left. I could feel it lingering in the corners of every quiet night, waiting for the next small sign that someone had been there again. Months later, we sold the house and left Pine Ridge altogether. We never found Daisy. I still check lost dog pages sometimes, hoping for a miracle, but deep down I know she's gone. What I cannot shake, even after all this time, is the image of that man on the camera. The way he bent down, adjusted the collar with care, and whispered like he already knew we would watch the footage later. Like it was meant for us. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, personal. To this day, I still replay that moment in my head. Standing barefoot on the porch, holding a warm collar that should have been around Daisy's neck. I never heard from the sheriff again, and maybe that is for the best. But sometimes, late at night when everything is still, I imagine a faint scratching sound on the door, just once or twice, enough to remind me that some things are better left unsolved. Moving into that small rental house on Birch Street felt like hitting a reset button I had been too afraid to press for years. The divorce had left me drained, and I thought a quiet neighborhood in Millhaven would give me a chance to breathe again. The house itself was simple, 2 bedrooms, creaky floors, and a narrow porch that faced the street. I remember how the air smelled faintly of pine when I signed the lease, and how the silence at night felt almost heavy, like the town had forgotten how to make noise. I spent my evenings unpacking slowly, taking my time to build a new routine that felt safe and predictable. It was maybe a week after I settled in that I started noticing the house across the street. It was identical in layout to mine, except for a larger bay window on the second floor. During the day, the place seemed empty. No movement, no car in the driveway, no lights. But at night, around 2 in the morning, something strange would happen. The curtains would open with a slow pull, like someone dragging fabric against dry air. I would always glance at the clock, and every single time it read 2:14 a.m. On the other side, behind that window, there was always a figure standing still, staring straight toward my house. At first, I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a reflection. I even tried ignoring it, closing my own blinds earlier and leaving a lamp on to keep from thinking about it. But curiosity kept winning. The next night, I waited. 2:13. The curtains across the street were still drawn. I leaned forward, eyes fixed on the window. Then, right on time, 2:14, the fabric slid apart, and there it was again. A silhouette, unmoving, like a statue carved from darkness. It was eerie not because it looked strange, but because it looked so deliberate, so precise, as if whoever stood there knew I would be watching. The following afternoon, I decided to walk over and knock on their door. The house looked abandoned up close. Paint peeling, grass overgrown, mailbox overflowing with circulars. I knocked twice, waited, and finally heard footsteps approaching from inside. A man opened the door halfway, maybe in his late 40s, wearing a faded green shirt with paint stains on the sleeves. I introduced myself and asked if someone in his house might be awake around 2 every morning, watching the street. He gave me a confused smile and said, "No one lives here but me, friend, and I sleep through the night." Something about his tone made the hairs on my neck rise, but I forced a polite nod and went back home. That night I tried to convince myself it was just an odd coincidence. Maybe the guy across the street had a weird schedule. Maybe he worked late and stretched before bed. Maybe anything. But when I stepped outside later to bring the trash bins in, I noticed the same faint outline behind the curtains again. It was not 2:14 yet. It was barely past midnight. I stood there for a few seconds pretending to check my phone while that dark shape seemed to shift slightly, like whoever it was had taken a step closer to the glass. I went back inside and locked the door, even though I had never been the kind of person to do that in a small town. The next morning, I found something stuck to my front door with a strip of tape. It was a printed photograph of me sleeping in bed. The angle was perfect, not from outside the house, but from somewhere inside the room. I checked every inch of that bedroom, the closet, the attic entrance, under the bed, and behind the dresser. Nothing. My first instinct was to call the sheriff's office. He came by, a broad man with a calm voice, and after I showed him the photo, he said it was probably some kids playing a prank. I asked if he could check the house across the street, but he just sighed and told me to try not to lose sleep over it. That night, I could not relax. I unplugged every electronic device and turned off my phone after hearing faint clicking noises on the line earlier that day. Around 2 in the morning, I sat on the couch with all the lights off, watching the window. When the clock struck 2:14, the curtains across the street opened again. This time, the figure raised its hand, slow and deliberate, as if waving. I stepped back instinctively, my body tense, trying to process what I was seeing. The motion lasted only a few seconds before the curtains closed again, sealing the window in darkness. The next day, I decided to confront the neighbor again, but when I crossed the street, the house looked completely deserted. Windows boarded up, front door sealed with a chain, grass taller than I remembered. I stood there, staring, feeling completely disoriented. It made no sense. I had spoken to someone here only a couple of days ago. I even knocked out of desperation, and the hollow sound that came back made it clear. There was no one inside. That night, I pushed a chair against the door and kept a flashlight next to the bed. Sleep would not come easily, so I just lay there listening. The house had a language of its own, wood expanding, pipes humming. But then there was a different sound, a faint scraping from somewhere near the hallway. It came in short bursts, like metal brushing against wood. When I finally got up and checked, nothing was there. Still, I could not shake the feeling that someone had walked through the living room just seconds before I did. The next morning, another photograph was waiting. This time it was taped to the mailbox, and it showed my kitchen from the corner near the back door. My heart sank because I recognized that corner. It was the one where the floorboard squeaked whenever I stepped on it. I went straight to the sheriff again, but he just looked at me with tired eyes and said there was no evidence of trespassing. I could tell he was humoring me, probably thinking the divorce had messed with my head. He even asked if I was taking any medication, which made me leave before saying something I would regret. Days passed, and the pattern kept repeating. Some nights the window across the street stayed dark, and I started to think it might be over. Then, just as I let my guard down, I would hear the faint click of my phone again or notice a light flickering from that same bay window. It was like whoever, or whatever it was, wanted to remind me I was being watched. I stopped eating properly, kept the blinds shut, and even began checking the locks 3, sometimes 4 times before bed. The paranoia was eating away at me, piece by piece. One night, desperate to prove I was not imagining things, I set up my old camera by the window, facing the house across the street. I let it record through the night, then watched the footage the next morning. The video was mostly dark and grainy until the exact time hit, 2:14 a.m. The curtains opened, slowly, and for the first time I saw the figure clearly. It was me, same face, same shirt I had worn that night, standing motionless in that window, staring back at my own house. I stared at the screen for a long time, my reflection frozen on top of that image of myself inside the other house. It made no sense. There was no way it could have been recorded unless someone had access to my camera or the footage had been altered. I deleted the video right away, then disconnected the camera, the router, everything that could send or receive a signal. For the rest of that day, I stayed by the window, watching the empty house, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. The curtains stayed shut, no lights came on, and for a while, I almost believed whatever had been haunting me was gone. But a few nights later, I woke to a faint scratching near my bedroom window. Not the soft hum of branches or wind, but a slow, deliberate drag, like fingernails against glass. I turned on the flashlight and froze at what I saw. On the outside of the window pane, pressed against the glass, was a single printed photo. It showed me sitting exactly as I was in that moment, flashlight in hand, mouth half open, eyes wide. I ripped it down. But before I could think of what to do next, the phone on my nightstand started ringing. I answered it out of instinct. Silence. Then a soft, steady clicking sound filled the line, the same one I had heard days earlier. The next morning, I packed my things and drove to a motel 2 towns away. When I called the landlord to explain, he told me something that has kept me awake ever since. He said the house across the street had been condemned for years. The last tenant, a man who looked, in his words, a lot like you, had been found inside, surrounded by hundreds of photographs of himself sleeping, all taken from impossible angles. The place was boarded up after that, and no one had lived there since. I asked him when that happened, and he said it had been over a decade ago. I have not gone back to Birch Street. My new apartment has no direct neighbors, and I keep the blinds drawn most of the time. Still, there are nights when I wake up around 2:14 without knowing why. Sometimes I think about that camera, about the reflection I saw in the footage. I try to tell myself it was stress, or sleep deprivation, or something explainable. But deep down, I know what I saw. And whatever stared back at me from that window, it was not just another person. It was me, or something pretending to be. The house I rented in Willow Creek was the kind of place you could drive past without noticing. A single-story home with fading green shutters, tucked between 2 larger houses, where the curtains always seemed half-drawn. I moved there 6 months ago, after taking a job at the local clinic. It felt safe at first. Small town, quiet nights, neighbors who waved without really saying much. My shifts were long, sometimes stretching into the early morning, but I liked coming home to silence. It felt earned, like a kind of peace only exhaustion could buy. The first time I heard the sound, It was almost subtle enough to dismiss. A faint shuffle, maybe a pipe settling, or a stray raccoon outside. But the noise didn't come from outside. It came from under the floor, soft steps that mirrored mine. I remember standing in the kitchen with a cup of tea, realizing that each time I took a step, something below seemed to echo it. Same rhythm, same pause, like a delayed imitation. Crouched down, pressing my ear against the worn linoleum, and for a few seconds there was nothing but the hum of the refrigerator. Then, a single deliberate step, right beneath me. I mentioned it to my landlord the next day. Mr. Callahan was a retired postal worker who lived 2 streets away and liked to talk about how quiet Willow Creek used to be. He chuckled when I told him about the footsteps, said something about my double shifts catching up to me. "You're hearing your own heartbeat in that old floor," he told me, tapping the wall like a man humoring a child. I laughed along, pretending it didn't bother me, but that night I left the kitchen light on before bed, just in case. Over the next few nights, the sounds returned, always around the same hour and somewhere between midnight and 1. Sometimes it was faint, like someone pacing carefully, trying not to be heard. Other times it came fast, right beneath my bedroom. I began to notice how perfectly it matched my own movements. If I walked 3 steps to the bathroom, 3 faint thuds followed below. When I stopped, it stopped. It got to the point where I found myself moving less, almost afraid to trigger it. The silence between us started to feel like a conversation. Sleep started coming harder. Even when I was exhausted, I'd wake to that dull creaking beneath me, perfectly in rhythm with my breathing. Sometimes it sounded like someone dragging their feet, slow and deliberate, as if testing how much noise they could make without waking me. One night, I slid out of bed and pressed my hand against the floor. The boards felt cold, like there was open space underneath. I'd never thought to check if the house had a crawl space. The idea of anyone being down there made me nauseous, but part of me wanted to know. The not knowing was worse. The next morning, I called Mr. Callahan again. This time, my voice shook as I told him I couldn't sleep, that the noises were getting louder. He sighed through the phone, said he'd stop by in the afternoon to take a look. When he arrived, he brought a flashlight and made a show of crawling under the porch. After a few minutes, he stood up, brushing dirt from his jeans. "Nothing but pipes and dust," he said, smiling in that tired way people do when they've already decided you're overreacting. I wanted to believe him. But that night, the sound started earlier, around 10. That was the first time I heard whispering. It wasn't clear words, more like someone humming under their breath, except the rhythm kept matching mine. I'd exhale, and half a second later, a faint echo followed beneath me. I remember standing in the middle of my living room whispering, "Hello?" and hearing the exact same word come back from under the floor, stretched out, distorted. I nearly ran out of the house, but I didn't. I stayed there, frozen in place, trying to convince myself it was some trick of acoustics, or a neighbor's television bleeding through the floor. But deep down, I knew where it was coming from. The next day, I came home from work to find a note inside my refrigerator. It was written on the back of a grocery receipt, my handwriting, or something close to it. The word said, "You left the door unlocked again." The problem was, I always double-checked my locks. Always. I tore through the house looking for signs of forced entry, but everything was exactly as I'd left it. I even checked my phone, scrolling through old photos just to make sure my handwriting didn't really look like that. It was similar, but not quite, like someone had practiced it. The following night, I decided to stay awake. I turned off every light except the one above the stove and sat at the kitchen table, with a mug of coffee that went cold an hour later. Around midnight, the air shifted. A heaviness settled over the house, like the atmosphere itself was waiting for me to move. Then came the first creak. I stood up slowly, testing the floor with one foot. Beneath me, a faint step answered. I took another, and it followed again. The sound wasn't coming from the edges of the room anymore. It was directly below my feet, keeping pace, closer than it had ever been. I grabbed the flashlight and crouched near the vent by the wall. The slats were old and bent, leaving a narrow view into the crawl space. When I shone the beam down, I expected to see dirt, maybe cobwebs, but something shifted in the light, a pale hand retreating just out of view. My breath caught in my throat and I stumbled backward, hitting the counter. The sound below grew frantic, scraping wood and fast shuffling like someone crawling away. I didn't chase it. I just stood there listening until it stopped completely. When the police arrived, they found the crawlspace entrance nailed shut from the inside. They pried it open, but there was no one there, just a blanket, some empty food wrappers, and a notebook filled with pages of my own daily routines. What time I left for work, when I came home, when I showered, even how long I stayed in each room. It went back months. The last entry said, "She doesn't know I can hear her breathing now." I moved out the next day, found another apartment in the next town, and changed my shifts at the clinic. I still don't know who was living beneath me or how long they'd been there, but sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet, I still pause before I take a step, half expecting something beneath me to take one too. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. The morning I found our prize stallion dead in his stall was when I finally understood we weren't dealing with ordinary neighbors anymore. I'm writing this from my sister's apartment in Chicago, 3 states away from the farm my wife Grace and I poured everything into for 6 years. We moved to rural Montana in 2018, chasing that American dream of sustainable living and organic farming on 40 acres of beautiful grassland bordered by cottonwood trees. Grace had inherited some money from her grandmother, and I'd been saving since college, working construction and living cheap. We bought the property from an elderly couple, the Millers, who'd been there 40 years and couldn't manage the work anymore. They warned us about the Crawfords next door, said they were particular people, but we figured every rural area had its quirky locals. God, if only we'd listened closer to what they weren't saying directly. The Crawfords owned about 300 acres surrounding our property on 3 sides. Earl, his 2 adult sons Tommy and Wade, and Tommy's wife Suzanne. Earl must have been pushing 70, with these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink when he stared at you, and arms like tree trunks despite his age. The sons were carbon copies of their father, just younger and meaner looking, especially Wade, who had this scar running from his left ear down to his jaw that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer. The first time we met them, they came over unannounced while we were still unpacking, stood at our fence line just watching us for maybe 20 minutes, before Earl finally called out. They wanted to buy our land, offered us exactly what we'd paid for it, said it used to be part of their family's original homestead back in the 1920s. When we politely declined, explaining we'd just arrived and planned to start our organic vegetable operation, Earl just nodded real slow, spit tobacco juice on our grass, and said, "We'll see how that works out for you." At first, everything seemed fine. We started our vegetable gardens, bought some chickens and goats, and that beautiful Arabian stallion I mentioned. His name was Mercury, and Grace loved that horse more than anything. The problems started small, almost like accidents. A gate left open here, letting our chickens wander into the road where 3 got hit by a truck. Our new rototiller disappeared from the barn one night, then showed up 2 weeks later in our pond, completely ruined. Grace's greenhouse had a brick thrown through it during a windstorm on a night with no wind. Each time something happened, we'd see the Crawfords the next day, and they'd ask how things were going with these little smirks on their faces. Earl would always mention how farming was tough work, how lots of city folks couldn't hack it, how that land had been in their family for generations before the Depression forced them to sell that section. Wade started driving his pickup along our shared fence line every morning at 5 a.m., laying on the horn for a good 30 seconds, claimed he was checking his cattle, though there weren't any cattle in that pasture. The escalation happened on a Saturday in early September. I was in town getting feed when Grace called me, barely able to speak through her tears. She'd gone to check on Mercury and found him thrashing in his stall, foam coming from his mouth, his eyes rolled back, showing pure white. By the time I got home, our vet Dr. Paulson was already there, but it was too late. Mercury was gone. The vet found traces of antifreeze in his water bucket. Someone had poisoned him deliberately. We called the sheriff's office immediately, and Deputy Coleman came out, took pictures, asked questions, wrote everything down carefully in his little notebook. Then he got this uncomfortable look on his face and explained that without direct evidence linking anyone to the crime, there wasn't much they could do. When I pointed out that the Crawfords were our only neighbors for miles, Coleman just shrugged and said Earl Crawford's cousin was the sheriff, had been for 12 years, and maybe we should consider installing security cameras if we were worried about our property. That night, we barely slept. Grace kept crying about Mercury, and I sat by the window with my grandfather's old shotgun across my lap, watching the darkness outside. Around 3 a.m., I saw headlights moving slowly along our driveway, stopping just before the motion sensor lights would trigger. The vehicle sat there for maybe 10 minutes, engine running before backing out and disappearing. The next morning, we found every single one of our vegetable rows had been sprayed with herbicide, 6 months of work destroyed overnight. The chemical smell was so strong it made your eyes water from 50 feet away. But the worst part was the message they'd spelled out in dead grass on our front lawn. Last chance. Each letter was probably 10 feet tall, burned into the earth with whatever poison they'd used. Grace wanted to leave right then, pack what we could fit in the truck and never look back. But I was angry, furious really, and made the stupid decision to confront them directly. I drove over to the Crawford place that afternoon, my shotgun visible in the truck's rear window, not to threaten, just to show I wasn't some pushover they could intimidate. Their property looked like something from a horror movie, honestly, with rusted equipment scattered everywhere, old cars on blocks, and these massive dogs on chains that went absolutely berserk when I pulled up. Earl came out first, then Tommy and Wade emerged from the barn, and Suzanne watched from the porch with this blank expression like she was watching television. I stayed in my truck, window down, and told Earl I knew what they'd done, that we had photos of everything, and if anything else happened, I'd make sure every newspaper and news station in the state heard about it. Earl walked up to my window real slow, leaned in close enough that I could smell the chewing tobacco and something else, something rotten on his breath. He said very quietly, "Boy, you don't know what you're playing with here. This land has been ours since before your grandfather was born." The Millers understood that. They stayed quiet, stayed small, and we let them play farmer for 40 years. But you come here with your organic this and sustainable that, putting up fancy signs, talking to folks in town about expanding, about buying the Jacobson plot that borders our south field. That ends now. Wade stepped closer to the truck then, carrying something in his hand I couldn't quite see at first. When he got close enough, I realized it was a cattle prod, the kind they use on livestock, and he was tapping it against his leg in this rhythmic pattern. Tommy circled around to the passenger side, and I noticed he had a pistol tucked into his waistband, not hidden, just there for me to see. "Here's what's going to happen," Earl continued, his voice still that quiet, controlled tone that was somehow worse than yelling. "You're going to go home, pack up your pretty wife, and be gone by Sunday. We'll buy your place for half what you paid. Call it a convenience fee for all the trouble you've caused. Or you can stay and find out what happens to people who don't respect the natural order of things out here. The Jacobsons thought they were tough too, back in 2016. Haven't seen them around lately, have you?" The way he said it made my chest tighten. I'd heard the Jacobsons had left suddenly in the middle of the night, left everything behind, never even listed their property for sale. It had gone to bank auction eventually. I drove home with Wade's pickup following me the entire way, riding so close I could see his grinning face in my rearview mirror. When I told Grace about the conversation, she broke down completely. That night, we moved our mattress into the walk-in closet of our bedroom, no windows there, and took turns staying awake. Around midnight, our motion sensor lights started going off one by one, starting from the barn and moving toward the house in a pattern that couldn't be animals or wind. Then we heard the barn doors slam open, heard our goats screaming. Not their normal sounds, but these high-pitched shrieks of terror. I grabbed the shotgun and headed for the door, but Grace held me back, begging me not to go out there. We called 911, but the dispatcher said all units were responding to a major accident on Highway 287. Would be at least 2 hours before anyone could come. We sat there in that closet, listening to our animals in distress, to footsteps on our porch, to someone trying our doorknobs one by one. At one point, whoever it was started whistling Amazing Grace right outside our bedroom window, and Grace had to cover her mouth to keep from screaming. When dawn finally came, we ventured outside to find carnage. 3 of our goats had been killed, their bodies arranged in a line by the barn door. Our chicken coop was demolished, feathers and blood everywhere. Though strangely, most of the chickens were just gone, not dead, just missing. They'd spray-painted Sunday on the side of our barn in red paint that looked disturbingly like blood in the morning light. Our truck had 4 flat tires. Every window on the greenhouse was systematically broken, and they'd dumped what must have been 50 gallons of motor oil into our well. The final touch was a dead coyote hung from our front gate, with a note pinned to it that read, "You're next." We took photos of everything, called the sheriff's office again, and this time Sheriff Crawford himself showed up. Earl's cousin, looking like an older, fatter version of the family. He walked around, nodded at the damage, and then told us with a straight face that it looked like we'd had some bad luck with wild animals, maybe a pack of coyotes or wild dogs. When I showed him the spray paint, the note, he suggested maybe we did it ourselves for insurance money. Said he'd need to investigate us for fraud if we pursued this any further. We left that afternoon, packed what we could fit in Grace's sedan, the truck was useless, and drove away from everything we'd built. As we passed the Crawford farm, all 4 of them were standing at their fence line, watching. Earl gave us a little wave, real friendly-like, and Wade fired his rifle into the air just once. A farewell message we understood perfectly. We stayed with Grace's sister for a week, trying to figure out what to do, contacted lawyers who all said the same thing. Without evidence and with local law enforcement against us, we had no case. Then we got a call from a neighbor we'd barely known, Mrs. Garrett, who lived about 5 miles down the road. She whispered into the phone like she was afraid someone might hear. Told us the Crawfords were living in our house now, had moved their stuff in the day after we left. Said everyone in town knew what they did to folks who bought that property, had been doing it for decades, but nobody dared speak up because Earl's family had connections everywhere. The sheriff, the bank president, even the district judge was married to Earl's niece. The bank foreclosed on our property 2 months later. We couldn't make the mortgage payments without being able to work the land or sell our harvests, and mysteriously, all our insurance claims were denied or tied up in investigations. Grace found out through a friend that the Crawfords bought our 40 acres at auction for a quarter of what we'd paid. Cash payment, no questions asked. The auctioneer was Earl's brother-in-law. We tried reaching out to the FBI, to state police, to anyone who might listen. But rural property disputes weren't exactly high priority, and without concrete evidence linking the Crawfords to specific crimes, we were just another couple with a sob story about bad neighbors. The worst part was learning we weren't the first. Mrs. Garrett eventually sent us newspaper clippings going back to the 1990s. Little mentions of families who'd bought that same property and left suddenly, some saying they'd been harassed, others just disappearing without explanation. The Millers, the couple who'd sold to us, finally returned our calls after months of silence. They were living in Florida now, and Mr. Miller's voice shook when he told me they'd tried to warn us subtly, but Earl had made it clear what would happen to them if they said too much to potential buyers. We're still in Chicago now, living in a 2-bedroom apartment, where the only green space is a small balcony where Grace grows herbs in pots. She doesn't talk about what happened much, but sometimes I catch her looking at photos of Mercury on her phone, and she'll close it quickly, pretending she was checking the weather. We both have regular jobs now. I'm back in construction, she's working at a dental office. and we tell people we used to live in Montana but don't elaborate. Sometimes I'll wake up at 3 a.m. thinking I hear that whistling outside our window, even though we're on the 8th floor. Last month I got a package with no return address. Inside was a photo of our old farm, the gardens all plowed under, cattle grazing where our vegetables used to grow, and the Crawfords standing in front of our house, their house now, all 4 of them smiling at the camera. On the back, someone had written, "Thanks for the improvements." I burned it in the sink, but Grace saw the ashes and knew. She applied for a job in Seattle the next day, and we're moving again next month. Sometimes the only way to win is to run far enough that they can't follow, and hope the next place doesn't have its own Crawfords waiting. People always ask me why I left Nebraska after 15 years of working the same farm. The truth is, after what happened that night in October 2022, I couldn't stand being alone in those fields anymore. I was 34, divorced, no kids, and I'd been managing the Brennan family's cattle operation since I got out of the Army. It was honest work, feeding the livestock, checking fences, making sure the water systems kept running through those brutal winters. The property sat on about 800 acres outside a town you've probably never heard of. Population barely pushing 2,000. Most nights, the only sounds were the cattle shifting in their pens, and maybe a coyote howling somewhere in the distance. I lived in a small house on the property. Nothing fancy, just a 2-bedroom place with a kitchen that leaked when it rained hard, and a porch where I'd sit with my coffee every morning, watching the sun come up over the cornfields. The neighboring farm belonged to the Novak family, and their daughter Cassie had been spiraling for about 3 years by then. She was maybe 28, used to be pretty before the meth got its hooks in her, had this long auburn hair she'd cut off with kitchen scissors one night, leaving these jagged chunks that stuck out at weird angles. Her dad, Frank, was a quiet guy who raised soybeans and kept to himself after his wife died of cancer. Cassie would show up at my place maybe twice a month, always with some story about needing gas money or her phone being shut off. She'd pick at these sores on her arms while she talked, her eyes darting around like she was watching for something nobody else could see. I usually gave her $20 just to get her to leave because arguing with her was pointless. She'd just come back the next night, knocking louder, sometimes throwing gravel at my bedroom window until I came outside. That particular Sunday started normal enough. I'd spent the morning fixing a section of fence the bulls had knocked down, then drove into town for groceries around noon. The cashier at the Save-A-Lot, Beverly, mentioned she'd seen Cassie at the gas station earlier, arguing with the manager about something. Beverly had this way of lowering her voice when she gossiped, leaning across the register like we were sharing state secrets. She said Cassie looked worse than usual, wearing this oversized green jacket even though it was almost 70 degrees out, and she kept pacing in circles by the pump, talking to herself. I just nodded and loaded my groceries, figured it was none of my business. By the time I got back to the farm, the sun was already starting to dip low, painting everything this burnt orange color that made the fields look like they were on fire. I remember thinking it was too quiet. Usually Frank's dogs would be barking by then, these 2 German shepherds he kept that would lose their minds every time a car drove past. I was in the barn around 8 that night, treating a calf with an infected hoof, when I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Not normal walking, more like someone stumbling, catching themselves, stumbling again. The barn door scraped open, and there was Cassie, but something was different this time. Her pupils were so dilated her eyes looked completely black, and she had this sheen of sweat across her forehead, even though the temperature had dropped to maybe 50 degrees. She was wearing that same green jacket Beverly mentioned, but now I could see these dark stains on the sleeves that looked almost brown in the barn's fluorescent lights. Her hands kept clenching and unclenching, and when she opened her mouth to speak, I noticed her bottom lip was split, blood dried in the corner. "I need your truck," she said, not asked, said like it was already decided. "And I need $300 right now." The way she emphasized those last 2 words made every instinct from my military days kick in. This wasn't her usual begging. This was desperation mixed with something else. Something that made me automatically take a step back toward the tool wall. I told her I didn't have that kind of cash on me, which was true. I maybe had $40 in my wallet. She started laughing, but it wasn't a real laugh. More like this broken sound that came out in bursts. "You don't understand," she kept saying, walking deeper into the barn, her sneakers leaving weird smudges on the concrete floor. That's when I noticed the pattern. The prints weren't just dirt, they had this reddish tint that left streaks behind each step. She started grabbing things off the shelves, a rope, some wire cutters, then dropped them like she forgot what she was looking for. "They're coming," she said, spinning around to face me. "I can hear their radios already, can you hear them?" I couldn't hear anything except the calf breathing heavy in its pen and my own heartbeat getting louder in my ears. She pulled something out of her jacket pocket, and for a second I thought it was a gun, but it was just her phone. The screen cracked so bad you could barely see anything on it. She kept pressing buttons that weren't there, her fingers jabbing at nothing, muttering numbers that didn't make sense. The smell hit me then, metallic and thick, like when you butcher a deer and don't clean up right away. It was coming from her clothes, especially that jacket. She must have seen me notice because she suddenly pulled it tighter around herself, even though I could see she was burning up, hair sticking to her neck with sweat. "Frank had an accident," she said. But the way she said accident, drawing it out like she was tasting the word, made my chest tighten. "He fell. In the kitchen. Hit his head on something." She wouldn't look at me when she said it, her eyes fixed on something past my shoulder, out in the darkness beyond the barn door. I asked if we needed to call an ambulance, already reaching for my phone, but she lunged forward and grabbed my wrist with both hands. Her grip was stronger than someone her size should have been capable of, fingernails digging in deep enough that I'd find crescents of dried blood there later. "No ambulance," she hissed. "Just the truck. Please. I'll go to Colorado. I know people there. They'll help me figure this out." That's when we both heard it, sirens still far off but getting closer, that distinctive wail cutting through the night air. Cassie's whole body went rigid, like someone had run electricity through her. She let go of my wrist and bolted for the barn door, but stopped at the threshold, looking out at the darkness. The yard light was motion activated, and it clicked on when she moved, illuminating her in this harsh white glow that made the stains on her clothes look almost purple. "You were always nice to me," she said, not turning around, "even when everyone else crossed the street when they saw me coming. Remember that time you fixed my car? That winter when the radiator cracked?" I did remember. It was 2 years ago, before things got really bad, when she still had moments of being the girl who used to win 4-H competitions and help her mom sell pies at the county fair. She took off running then, not toward the road but into the cornfields, disappearing between the rows that hadn't been harvested yet. The stalks were dry and brittle this late in the season, and I could hear her crashing through them for maybe 30 seconds before the sound faded into nothing. I stood there in the barn for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two, trying to process what had just happened. The sirens were definitely getting closer, and now I could see red and blue lights flickering against the clouds from the direction of the Novak farm. My first thought was to follow her, try to talk sense into her, but something kept me rooted in place. Maybe self-preservation, maybe just the knowledge that whatever had happened at Frank's place, I didn't want to be the one to find out. I walked back to my house, legs feeling like they were made of water, and locked the door behind me for the first time since I'd moved in. Through my kitchen window, I could see the emergency vehicles pulling into Frank's driveway, at least 4 police cars and an ambulance. They didn't use their sirens once they arrived, which somehow made everything worse. Officers with flashlights started spreading out across the property, their beams cutting through the darkness like searchlights. One headed toward the cornfield where Cassie had disappeared, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for shouts or gunshots or something, but there was just the steady sweep of lights and the occasional crackle of radio chatter that I couldn't quite make out. Around midnight, there was a knock at my door, 3 solid raps that made me jump even though I'd been expecting it. 2 deputies stood on my porch, both young guys who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The taller one, Officer Daniels according to his name tag, asked if I'd seen Cassie Novak tonight. I hesitated for maybe 2 seconds before telling them everything. Her showing up at the barn, asking for money and my truck, the stains on her clothes, how she'd run into the cornfield. Daniels wrote everything down in this little notebook while the other deputy, Reeves, kept glancing back toward the Novak farm. "Sir, we're going to need you to stay inside tonight," Daniels said when I finished. "Lock your doors and windows. If she comes back, do not let her in. Call 911 immediately." That's when Reeves finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Frank Novak is dead. Someone shot him with his own hunting rifle, then beat him with it." The words just hung there in the October air, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. They found her the next morning almost 10 miles away, walking along County Road 12, in nothing but a t-shirt and jeans. She ditched the green jacket somewhere in the fields. A farmer named Dennis Briggs called it in, said she was just walking down the middle of the road, talking to herself, her feet bloody from running through the harvested cornfields barefoot. The deputies who picked her up said she didn't resist, just kept asking them if they could stop at McDonald's on the way to the station because she hadn't eaten in 3 days. The full story came out over the next few weeks through the local newspaper and courthouse gossip. She'd been awake for 4 days straight, convinced Frank was poisoning her food, putting cameras in her bedroom, reporting her to the DEA. The prosecution said she'd taken his hunting rifle from the garage, a Winchester Model 70 he'd bought himself for his 60th birthday, waited for him to come home from checking his soybeans, and shot him once in the chest when he walked through his back door. When he didn't die right away, when he tried to crawl toward the phone in the living room, she'd finished it with the rifle butt. The coroner said it took him maybe 20 minutes to die, leaving a trail of blood from the kitchen to the hallway where they found him. The trial lasted 3 days. I had to testify about that night in the barn, sitting in a courtroom that smelled like old wood and floor wax, looking at Cassie in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. She'd gained weight in county jail, her face fuller, her eyes clear for the first time in years. When the prosecutor asked me to describe her state that night, I looked right at her, and she gave me this small nod, like she was giving me permission to tell the truth. Her court-appointed lawyer tried to argue diminished capacity, brought in experts to talk about methamphetamine psychosis, how someone could completely lose touch with reality after days without sleep. But the jury only took 4 hours to come back with guilty on second-degree murder, 25 to life. When they read the verdict, Cassie didn't react at all, just stared at her hands folded on the defendant's table. Her father's sister, Nancy, was the only family member who showed up. She sat in the back row crying quietly into a handkerchief that had little blue flowers embroidered on it. I left Nebraska 2 months after the trial ended. Couldn't handle the empty Novak farmhouse next door, the yellow police tape that stayed up for weeks, the way Frank's soybeans just rotted in the field because no one harvested them. The Brennans understood when I gave my notice, even helped me find a job with a ranch operation in Wyoming. Sometimes I still dream about that night. Not nightmares exactly, just replaying those moments in the barn, wondering if I could have done something different. If I'd given her the truck keys, would Frank still be alive? Or would there have been 2 bodies instead of 1? The detective told me later they found the green jacket she'd been wearing, half buried in a drainage ditch 3 miles from where they picked her up. It was Frank's jacket, one he wore for hunting, and the stains I'd seen were exactly what I'd thought they were. He also told me something that still bothers me. They found my name written on a piece of paper in her pocket, along with 4 other names I didn't recognize. When I asked what that meant, he just shrugged and said they'd probably never know. Cassie took a plea deal to avoid trial for premeditated murder, and she never explained the list. I still wake up sometimes wondering if I was supposed to be next, or if that paper meant something else entirely. Something only a mind twisted by 4 days of sleepless paranoia could understand. Most people dream about retiring to the countryside for peace and quiet, right? Well, let me tell you about the nightmare that unfolded when my wife Jennifer and I bought our little farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania back in 2017. We'd saved for 15 years to escape the city grind. Found this perfect 20-acre property with a renovated 1940s farmhouse, complete with a red barn and a creek running through the back. The realtor mentioned our neighbor to the east, Harold Fitzgerald, had been farming the adjacent land for 40 years, said he was particular about his property lines. That should have been our first warning, but we were too excited about our vegetable garden plans and the chicken coop we wanted to build. The day we moved in, Harold was already standing at our shared fence line with a surveyor's map, explaining exactly where our property ended and his began. Within the first week, Harold had visited us 4 times, each visit more uncomfortable than the last. He'd show up unannounced, always carrying that same laminated survey map, pointing out violations we didn't even know we were committing. Our moving truck had apparently driven 3 feet onto his access road, leaving tire marks he photographed extensively. Jennifer had walked our golden retriever, Bailey, along what we thought was a public path, but Harold produced documents showing he'd purchased those rights in 1993. He spoke in this measured, quiet tone that never quite matched the intensity in his pale blue eyes, like he was struggling to contain something darker. He installed motion sensor lights along our entire shared property line, flooding our bedroom with harsh white light whenever a deer wandered through. When I asked him about it, he said he needed to monitor the boundary integrity and suggested we install blackout curtains if it bothered us. The real problem started about 2 months in, when we decided to repair the old fence on our western boundary. Harold appeared within minutes of the contractor's arrival, demanding to see permits and property surveys, even though the fence was nowhere near his land. He'd installed cameras, we discovered, at least 6 of them that we could count, all aimed at different angles of our property. The contractor, a local guy named Brett, pulled me aside and warned me that Harold had driven off 3 different families from our property over the past decade. Man measures his corn rows with a ruler, Brett said. Filed complaints against the Johnsons because their maple tree dropped leaves on his side. That evening, Harold left a typed letter in our mailbox 3 pages long, detailing the proper protocols for any modifications to our property, including a requirement to notify him 72 hours in advance of any work crews arriving. Things escalated that Friday when Jennifer planted sunflowers along our side of the fence. I was in town getting supplies when Harold confronted her, claiming the flowers would attract birds that might eat his corn seed. Jennifer tried to explain they were 30 feet from his crops, but Harold had already taken dozens of photos, documenting what he called agricultural sabotage. He started showing up at odd hours, sometimes at 5 in the morning, sometimes near midnight, always finding some reason to complain. Our porch light was too bright and disrupted his chickens' laying schedule. Our guests parked too close to the road. The smell from our compost bin was carrying over to his property. He'd stand there with his clipboard, making notes while he talked, never raising his voice, but somehow making every word feel like a threat. The other neighbors, the Andersons to our west, started avoiding us, and I later learned Harold had told them we were problem residents who didn't respect rural traditions. The morning everything changed was a Saturday in late July. I woke up to Jennifer crying in the kitchen, staring out the window at our chicken coop. All 6 of our chickens were dead, arranged in a perfect line along the fence that bordered Harold's property. Their necks had been wrung, and someone had placed them precisely 18 inches apart, measured exactly. I knew it was exact because there was a measuring tape still lying there, one of those old metal ones with HF engraved on the side. When I confronted Harold, he was already in his barn, cleaning his boots with methodical precision. He looked up at me with this blank expression and said, our chickens had been trespassing on his land repeatedly, and that in farming communities there were consequences for poor animal husbandry. He suggested I check my property more carefully, maybe install better fencing, and then went back to cleaning his boots like we'd been discussing the weather. I called the sheriff's office, but Deputy Morrison just looked tired when he arrived. He took photos, made notes, but explained that without direct evidence, there wasn't much he could do. "Harold's been here longer than anyone," he said. "Never been caught doing anything illegal." That afternoon, I found Harold installing a new camera on a pole right at our property line, this one with a speaker system attached. He waved at me while adjusting the angle, making sure it captured our entire backyard. Jennifer wanted to leave right then, pack everything and go back to the city, but I convinced her we couldn't let him drive us away. We'd invested everything in this place. That night, the speaker crackled to life at 2 a.m. with Harold's voice, informing us that our dog had been barking for approximately 4 minutes, and reminding us about county noise ordinances. Over the next 3 days, Harold's behavior became increasingly erratic and frightening. He started patrolling our fence line every 4 hours, day and night, carrying a long stick that he'd drag along the fence posts, creating this rhythmic metallic sound that echoed across our property. Jennifer found him standing in our vegetable garden one morning, pulling up our tomato plants and examining their roots. When she screamed at him to leave, he calmly explained he was checking for agricultural diseases that might spread to his crops, cited some obscure farming statute from 1952 that he claimed gave him the right. He'd filled our mailbox with printed articles about property disputes that had ended badly, headlines highlighted in yellow marker. One evening, we came home to find he'd spray-painted perfect straight lines across our lawn, marking what he called optimal mowing patterns for rural properties, the paint soaking deep into the grass we'd spent months nurturing. The Andersons finally broke their silence when Harold poisoned their pond. They'd stocked it with bass and bluegill 3 years earlier, and one morning every single fish was floating belly up in water that reeked of industrial pesticide. Harold claimed runoff from their improperly maintained septic system had been contaminating his groundwater, showed them his own water tests that nobody could verify. That same week, the Brennans on the other side of Harold's property found their prized dairy cow dead in the field, foam around its mouth suggesting poisoning. Harold expressed sympathy, mentioned how dangerous wild plants could be if property wasn't properly maintained, offered to help them identify problematic vegetation. The veterinarian found traces of ethylene glycol in the cow's system, basically antifreeze, but again, no proof of how it got there. We all knew, though. We started having meetings at the Anderson place, 5 families comparing notes, realizing Harold had been systematically terrorizing each of us, always staying just within legal boundaries. The breaking point came on a Wednesday morning when I found Bailey convulsing in our yard. Our beautiful golden retriever was dying, white foam around his mouth, his body jerking in ways that still haunt me. Jennifer held him while I drove frantically to the emergency vet, but he died in her arms before we got halfway there. The vet found rat poison in his system, the kind Harold bought in bulk from the farm supply store. When we got home, shattered and empty, Harold was pressure washing his driveway, and he stopped to tell us he'd seen strange dogs around his property lately, suggested we should have kept better control of our animal. The way he said it, with this slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, I knew he wanted me to know it was him. I lunged at him, but Jennifer grabbed my arm and Harold just stood there with the pressure washer still running, daring me to cross onto his property, his finger hovering over his phone to call the police. That night, I couldn't sleep. Just sat on our porch with my father's old hunting rifle across my lap, watching Harold's house. Around 3 a.m, I saw him walking through our property with a flashlight and what looked like a pesticide sprayer. He was methodically spraying something along the edges of our vegetable garden, taking his time, knowing I was watching. When he saw me stand up, he waved the flashlight in my direction and shouted that he was treating for invasive insects that were threatening his crops, had all the proper documentation if I wanted to check. Jennifer found me at dawn, still sitting there, the rifle now fully loaded, and she knew we'd reached a point where someone was going to die if we didn't do something drastic. The other families were just as desperate. Mrs. Anderson had started having panic attacks, and Brett Brennan was talking about handling things the old way, which scared me almost as much as Harold did. The solution came from the most unexpected place. Harold's own obsession with control. Jennifer had been secretly recording everything for weeks with her phone. But the real breakthrough was when the Brennans' teenage son, Kevin, revealed he'd hacked into Harold's camera system. The old farmer had been recording everything, creating detailed logs of every violation he witnessed, building what he probably thought was evidence against us. But Kevin found something else in those files. Harold had recorded himself poisoning the Andersons' pond, documenting the correct mixture of chemicals to eliminate aquatic trespassing. He'd filmed himself placing tainted meat along our fence line, narrating how this would solve the dog problem permanently. There were dozens of videos, Harold's own voice calmly explaining his actions, justifying every sick thing he'd done as protecting his property rights. The FBI got involved when we found videos suggesting he'd done similar things at his previous farm in Ohio, where a family's house had mysteriously burned down after they'd refused to sell him their land. Harold was arrested on a Sunday morning while adjusting his cameras. He didn't resist, just kept insisting the deputies needed to follow proper procedures, demanding they stay off certain parts of his property even as they put him in handcuffs. The investigation revealed he'd been documenting his harassment campaigns for 23 years, across 4 different states, keeping meticulous records that ultimately became his downfall. He's serving 15 years now in federal prison, and we've slowly started to heal, though Jennifer still can't plant anything near that fence line. The other families stayed, and we became closer than any neighbors I've ever had, bonded by what we survived together. Sometimes I still hear phantom sounds of that stick dragging along the fence posts at night, but it's just the wind. Harold's farm was sold to a young couple from California who turned it into a lavender farm, and the smell drifting over on summer evenings almost makes you forget what happened there. Almost. Sometimes I still drive past that old property line where everything went wrong, and I can't help but remember how normal that Thursday morning started. I was 34, managing my family's wheat farm in eastern Kansas, after my dad's stroke left him partially paralyzed. The farm had been in our family for 4 generations, about 800 acres of decent soil that kept us comfortable enough. My wife Laura and I had just celebrated our 10th anniversary, and our twin boys were starting 2nd grade at the local elementary school. Life was predictable in the way that farm life tends to be. You wake up before dawn, check the equipment, monitor the crops, fix whatever broke overnight, and go to bed exhausted but satisfied. That morning I was drinking coffee on the porch, watching the sun paint the wheat fields gold, completely unaware that by nightfall I'd be loading my shotgun and barricading my family inside our house. The Walkers owned the property adjacent to ours, and for as long as anyone could remember, there'd been tension about where exactly our land ended and theirs began. Old Man Walker, that's what everyone called Eugene Walker, even though he was barely 60, had inherited his 1,000 acres from his father, just like I had. The original survey markers from the 1890s had long since disappeared, and both our families had different documents claiming ownership of a strip of land about 40 feet wide and half a mile long that ran between our properties. It sounds like nothing, but that strip had the best soil in the county and access to Millstone Creek, which never ran dry even in the worst droughts. For decades we'd shared an uneasy truce about it. Nobody farmed it, nobody fenced it, and we all pretended it didn't exist. But that morning, as I finished my coffee, I spotted something that made my chest tighten. A line of brand new steel fence posts glinting in the sunrise, marching right down the middle of that disputed strip. I drove my pickup down there, hoping maybe I was seeing things wrong from the distance. But no, there they were. Professional-grade posts sunk deep into the ground, with rolls of wire fencing stacked nearby. Eugene's son, Craig, was there with 2 hired hands stretching measuring tape between posts. Craig was 38, built like a linebacker gone to seed, with these small, mean eyes that always seemed to be calculating something. He'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and came back different, according to folks in town. Quieter, but with this coiled tension that made people uncomfortable. When he saw me approaching, He straightened up real slow, like he'd been expecting me. The two workers, young guys I didn't recognize, probably from a couple counties over, kept working, but I could see them watching us from the corners of their eyes. The morning had gotten humid already, and crickets were screaming in the tall grass, but everything else had gone dead quiet, even the birds. "Morning, neighbor," Craig said, but the way he said neighbor sounded like he was spitting out something bitter. He was wearing a faded green t-shirt with the sleeves cut off, and I could see a tattoo on his shoulder, some kind of military insignia with words in Latin I couldn't read. His hands were covered in fresh dirt, and he kept flexing them while we talked, making the veins in his forearms pop out like rope under his sunburned skin. Dad decided it was time we made things official. Got ourselves a new survey done last month. Professional outfit from Topeka, all legal and proper. Shows this strip belongs to us, always has. He pulled out a folded document from his back pocket, waved it at me but didn't offer to let me read it. The paper looked official enough from where I stood, with a gold seal and everything. But something about how he was smiling, just this slight upturn at the corner of his mouth, made my skin prickle with unease. I told him we'd need to see that survey, maybe get our lawyer involved, and that's when his whole demeanor shifted. The fake friendliness dropped away like a mask falling off, and he stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the Copenhagen tobacco on his breath and see the little burst blood vessels in the whites of his eyes. "Your family's been stealing from us for 60 years, he said, voice low and steady. "Taking water that wasn't yours, growing wheat on soil you had no right to. My granddad was too soft to do anything about it, and my dad spent too many years trying to be neighborly. But I'm not them." One of the workers dropped a fence post with a loud clang, and we both turned to look. When I turned back, Craig had pulled out his phone and was taking pictures of me standing there. "For the record," he said, "in case you try anything stupid, we've got cameras up now too, 3 of them with night vision, watching that strip 24/7. The rest of that morning passed in a blur of phone calls, to our family lawyer, to the county clerk's office, to my uncle who dealt with the Walkers back in the 80s. Nobody could give me immediate answers, but everyone said the same thing. Don't do anything rash, let the legal system handle it. Easy for them to say. By noon, the Walkers had strung up half the fence already, and I could see it from my kitchen window. This ugly scar of galvanized steel cutting across land my grandfather had worked with his own hands. Laura kept the boys inside even though they wanted to play in the yard, and she had this worried crease between her eyebrows that only showed up when things were really bad. Around 2 o'clock, I decided to move our tractor to the east field. Needed to disc some ground for winter wheat planting anyway. But when I got to the equipment shed, I could smell it before I saw it. Diesel fuel, everywhere. Someone had punctured the fuel tank on our John Deere, and there was a massive puddle of rainbow-slicked fuel soaking into the dirt floor. The hole in the tank was clean, probably made with a cordless drill. Deliberate, not accidental. Must have happened during the night or early morning before I'd checked the shed. 500 gallons of diesel, at least $3,000 worth, just seeping into the ground. But worse than the money was the message. They could get to our equipment whenever they wanted. I called the sheriff's office and Deputy Martinez came out, took pictures, made a report. But without proof, without cameras of our own, there wasn't much he could do. Could have been vandals, he said, though we both knew better. He'd been called out to the Walker property just last month when Craig beat a door-to-door salesman with a tire iron for trespassing. The guy didn't press charges. Craig's dad paid his medical bills and then some. But everyone knew Craig was capable of violence. Martinez told me to install security cameras, maybe motion lights, and to call immediately if anything else happened. That afternoon, while I was at the farm supply store pricing security systems, Laura called me crying. Really crying, not just upset. She'd gone to check on our chickens and found them all dead. 43 laying hens and our rooster, scattered around the coop like someone had tossed them there. No wounds, no blood, no signs of a predator. The water trough had this oily film on top, and there was a chemical smell she couldn't identify. Poison, had to be. Those birds were her project, something she'd started to bring in extra money selling eggs at the farmer's market. She'd named them all, stupid names like Pecky and Feather Locklear, and the boys helped her collect eggs every morning before school. Now they were just dead bodies that we'd have to burn because we couldn't risk burying poisoned animals where they might contaminate the groundwater. While she was telling me this, I noticed a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper. Handwritten in block letters, "Fences make good neighbors, shame about your birds. Worse things happen to stubborn people." I drove home doing 90 on back roads, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The smart thing would have been to pack up the family and leave for a few days, stay with Laura's parents in town while lawyers sorted things out. But when you've worked land for 4 generations, when your great-grandfather's sweat is in that soil, you don't just run. Plus, I was angry. The kind of anger that makes you stupid and brave in equal measure. When I got home, Laura had already pulled the boys out of school early and locked all the doors. She'd found another note, this one nailed to our barn door with a 16-penny nail driven so deep, I'd need a crowbar to get it out. "You have until midnight to remove your objections to the fence. Your well water sure would taste funny with the right additives." Our well was 200 feet deep, supplied our house and irrigated 10 acres of vegetables Laura grew. If they poisoned that, we'd be finished. By 6 o'clock, I'd made my decision. Called my brother Glenn, who lived an hour away, told him to come with his hunting rifle and camping gear. Called 2 cousins who'd served in Iraq, asked them to bring whatever they felt comfortable bringing. These weren't violent men, but they were family, and in farm country, that still meant something. We set up in shifts, someone watching the well house, someone watching the equipment shed, someone walking the perimeter with our German shepherd, Duke, who'd been going crazy all day, growling at shadows and barking at nothing. Around 8:30, just as the sun was setting behind the wheat fields, Duke started going absolutely mental near the southern property line. Glenn and I ran down there with flashlights and shotguns, found fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt, and 5 dead crows arranged in a circle around a wooden stake. The stake had another note, "Last warning." The crows' eyes had been removed, just empty sockets staring at nothing, and their feet were tied together with baling twine. At 11:47 p.m., everything went silent, that unnatural kind of quiet where even the insects stopped making noise. Duke, who'd been pacing and whining, suddenly went still and pointed toward the access road. Through the darkness, we could see headlights approaching with their high beams off, just the dim yellow of old fog lights. 3 vehicles, 2 pickups and what looked like an old Bronco, creeping along at maybe 5 miles per hour. They stopped about 100 yards from our house, engines still running, and we could see cigarette cherries glowing as people got out. My cousin Rodney had his night vision scope from his military days, and he counted 8 men, all carrying something. "They've got jerry cans," he whispered. And I think, yeah, that's definitely a rifle on the tall one. We were outnumbered, but we had the defensive position and they didn't know we were ready for them. Glenn chambered around in his 30-06, the sound carrying clear across the field. The vehicles immediately killed their engines, and we heard doors slamming, urgent whispers, then Craig's voice cutting through the darkness. "Just wanting to talk, neighbor. No need for anyone to get hurt tonight." But they didn't approach, didn't move forward. They stayed by their vehicles for maybe 10 minutes, occasionally flashing lights toward the house, toward the barn, toward the well house where my other cousin was hidden. Then, just as suddenly as they'd come, they loaded back up and left, driving fast this time, kicking up dust that glowed red in their taillights. We stayed on watch until dawn, jumping at every sound, but they never came back. Found out later from Deputy Martinez that someone had called in an anonymous tip about armed men threatening violence at the Walkers' property, except the caller gave our address instead. If the sheriff had shown up and found us armed to the teeth, it would have looked like we were the aggressors. But Martinez knew both families, knew the history, and he'd driven by the Walkers' place first, seen their vehicles weren't there, and figured out what was really happening. The next morning, something strange happened. Old man Walker himself showed up at our door alone, looking about 10 years older than the last time I'd seen him. His hands were shaking as he held his John Deere cap, and there were dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept either. "I didn't know," he said, voice cracking. "About the chickens, the tractor, none of it. Craig, he's not well, not since he came back. I found the jerry cans in the barn this morning, found the receipts for the cameras, the poison." He pulled out a thick envelope from his jacket, handed it to me with trembling fingers. "That's $20,000. For the damages, the diesel, the birds, and then some. I'm sending Craig away to his uncle's place in Arizona. Already got him on a bus this morning. Told him if he comes back, I'm writing him out of the will." He looked at the disputed strip of land, visible from our porch where that new fence stood like an accusation. "I'll take it down. The fence. Today. We'll go back to how it was. Nobody farms it, nobody claims it. Maybe our grandkids can figure it out someday when we're all gone." I wanted to stay angry, wanted to refuse his money and demand justice, but looking at that broken old man, I just felt tired. We took the money, watched him spend the afternoon pulling up fence posts by himself, Craig's hired hands nowhere to be seen. Laura and I used part of the money to install a serious security system, cameras covering every angle, motion sensors, the works. We never saw Craig again, though sometimes cars would slow down near our property line at night, and we'd wonder. The disputed strip grew wild with prairie grass and wildflowers, like maybe that's what it was always supposed to be. The Walkers sold their place 2 years later to a corporate farming operation out of Texas, and Eugene died of a heart attack 6 months after that. People in town said it was the stress of what Craig had become, the shame of it. I still farm that land, still check those cameras every night before bed. And sometimes when I'm out working near that strip of wild ground, I think about how thin the line is between neighbors and enemies, how a 40-foot piece of dirt can turn normal people into something else entirely, something capable of things they'd never imagined. The farmhouse stood about 40 minutes outside of town, surrounded by cornfields that stretched endlessly in every direction. I was 21, finishing my junior year at State University, and when my roommates Jordan and Blake found this rental listing for dirt cheap, we jumped on it immediately. The place was ancient, probably built in the 1940s with creaking wooden floors and windows that rattled whenever the wind picked up. But it had 4 bedrooms, a massive kitchen with one of those old cast-iron stoves, and rent that was less than what we'd been paying for our cramped apartment near campus. We moved in during early May, right after finals, planning to stay through the summer while we worked our internships. The isolation felt peaceful at first, therapeutic even, after months of dormitory chaos and constant noise from other students. Our nearest neighbors lived in a double-wide trailer about 200 yards away, separated from our property by a deteriorating chicken wire fence that barely stood 5 feet tall. From day one, we could hear them arguing, violent, screaming matches that echoed across the empty fields between us. The man had a voice like gravel being crushed, deep and threatening, while the woman's shrieks would pierce through our walls even with all the windows closed. Sometimes we'd hear glass breaking, furniture being thrown, doors slamming so hard the sound would make us jump. Jordan kept saying we should call someone, but Blake always talked him out of it, insisting it wasn't our business, that getting involved with neighbors like that only meant trouble. I agreed with Blake, honestly. These people seemed dangerous, unpredictable, and the last thing we needed was to make enemies with the only other humans for miles around. The particular night everything went wrong started like any other. It was a Tuesday in late June, humid and sticky, with thunder clouds building on the horizon but never quite delivering the rain we desperately needed. I'd gotten home from my internship at the Agricultural Extension Office around 6, exhausted from spending the day cataloging soil samples in a warehouse without air conditioning. Jordan was already cooking dinner, his famous spaghetti with meat sauce that was really just ground beef and jarred marinara, but we acted like it was gourmet. Blake was out on the front porch, smoking cigarettes and scrolling through his phone, occasionally shouting commentary about whatever video he was watching. The neighbors had been quiet all day, which should have been my first warning sign. In the 3 weeks since we'd moved in, there hadn't been a single day without at least one screaming match from that trailer. But that evening, nothing. Just the sound of crickets and the distant rumble of thunder that never got any closer. Around 11:30, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep despite the suffocating heat. Our ancient window unit AC had died the week before, and the landlord kept promising to fix it real soon. I had my window cracked open, hoping for even the slightest breeze when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of metal being cut. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone working with wire cutters or tin snips. At first, I convinced myself it was just the storm finally rolling in, maybe wind catching something metal outside. But the sound continued, steady and purposeful, and it was coming from the direction of that chicken wire fence. I sat up in bed, straining to see through the darkness outside my window. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and all I could make out were vague shapes and shadows moving where they shouldn't be moving. I crept out of bed, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and made my way to Jordan's room down the hall. His door was slightly open, and I could see him sitting up in bed, his face illuminated by his phone screen. "You hear that?" I whispered, and he nodded, eyes wide. We both moved to his window, which had a better view of the fence line. That's when we saw them, 3 figures working on the fence with what looked like bolt cutters. They were methodical, cutting through section after section, creating an opening large enough for a person to walk through. One of them kept looking back toward the trailer, like he was checking to make sure no one was watching from there. Another one was wearing something reflective, maybe a watch or a chain, that caught what little light there was each time he moved. The third guy was massive, probably 6'4" or 6'5", with shoulders that looked like he could flip a car if he wanted to. They weren't trying to be quiet either, which somehow made it worse. They knew no one would stop them. Blake must have heard us moving around, because suddenly he was in the doorway, asking what was going on in his usual too loud voice. Jordan and I both shushed him frantically, pointing toward the window. When Blake saw what was happening, his whole demeanor changed. He pulled out his phone, hands trembling as he dialed 911. The dispatcher asked a million questions. Our address, how many intruders, were they armed? Were we in immediate danger? Blake kept his voice low, barely above a whisper, giving her all the information while Jordan and I watched the men finish cutting through the fence. They stepped through the opening they'd created, and that's when my whole body went rigid with fear. They weren't heading toward the trailer. They were walking straight toward our house, spreading out as they moved, like they'd done this before and knew exactly how to surround a building. The dispatcher was still asking questions, but Blake had gone silent, just staring out the window. I grabbed the phone from him and whispered that 3 men had cut through our fence and were approaching our house right now. She said units were on the way, maybe 15 minutes out. 15 minutes. In that moment, 15 minutes felt like 15 hours. The big guy was heading toward our back door, the one that led into the kitchen. The other 2 were splitting up, one going left toward the garage, the other right toward the front porch. We could hear their footsteps on the gravel driveway, slow and deliberate. Jordan ran downstairs to check the locks, and I heard him cursing because the back door's deadbolt had been broken since we moved in, another thing the landlord promised to fix. All we had was the regular lock on the doorknob, the kind you could probably break with one solid kick. Blake was frantically looking for something to defend ourselves with, but what did we have? Kitchen knives? A baseball bat Jordan brought for the recreational softball league he never joined? Then came the sound that still wakes me up some nights, the doorknob on the back door slowly turning. Just a subtle squeak of metal on metal, but in that silent house it sounded like a scream. The knob turned all the way, hit the lock, and stopped. There was a pause, maybe 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. Then the door shook as someone pulled on it hard, testing it. Jordan was down there alone, and I could hear him breathing heavy, probably standing just feet away from whoever was on the other side of that door. The pulling stopped, and then we heard voices, low and muffled, like they were discussing something. One of them laughed. Not a normal laugh, but something guttural and mean. The kind of laugh that comes right before someone does something terrible. The front door handle started turning too, and that's when Blake completely lost it, screaming at the top of his lungs for them to get away, that the police were coming, that we had guns even though we definitely didn't. Everything erupted into chaos after Blake's outburst. The men outside started pounding on both doors simultaneously, violent banging that shook the entire house. I could hear wood splintering around the back door frame where Jordan was, and he came running up the stairs, taking them 3 at a time. His face was white as paper, and he kept saying the door was about to give. We barricaded ourselves in Blake's room, shoving his dresser against the door, then his desk, then anything else we could move. The pounding downstairs got louder, more aggressive, and then we heard glass shatter. The kitchen window. They were coming in. I remember thinking about every horror movie I'd ever watched, how I always said the characters were stupid for not fighting back or having a plan. But in that moment, all I could do was stand there paralyzed, listening to the sound of feet hitting our kitchen floor. Heavy boots, multiple sets, moving through the house we'd been living in for barely a month. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the stairs and we could hear them talking. One voice was saying something about checking upstairs, another mentioned the car in the driveway, and the third one, the deep voice, kept repeating that we needed to learn to mind our own business. That phrase stuck with me because we hadn't done anything. We'd never called the cops on the neighbors, never complained, never even made eye contact with them the few times we'd seen them outside. Then the stairs started creaking under someone's weight, slow and deliberate, like they wanted us to hear them coming. Blake was on the phone with 911 again, practically sobbing, telling them someone was in our house, they were coming upstairs, please hurry. Jordan had found a crowbar in Blake's closet from some project he'd never finished, and he stood facing the door, gripping it so tight his knuckles were white. The footsteps reached the landing, and we could hear breathing on the other side of our makeshift barricade. The doorknob rattled, then someone pushed against the door, testing the barricade. The dresser moved maybe an inch, and all 3 of us threw our weight against it, pushing back. The person on the other side laughed again, that same horrible sound from before, and said something like, 3 little college boys want to play tough. Then came a massive impact, like someone had thrown their entire body against the door. The dresser shifted, the desk behind it scraped across the floor, and a gap opened up just wide enough for me to see an eye peering through. Bloodshot, dilated, wild. The pupil was so enlarged it looked completely black, and there were broken blood vessels all around the iris. That eye locked onto mine for what couldn't have been more than 2 seconds, but I can still see it perfectly when I close my eyes. Then suddenly sirens, distant but getting louder fast. The eye disappeared and we heard rapid footsteps going back down the stairs, voices shouting to each other, the back door slamming open so hard it hit the wall. We stayed barricaded in that room even after we saw the police lights flooding through the window, red and blue painting everything in alternating colors. It took the officers actually announcing themselves, showing badges through the gap in the door, before we finally started moving the furniture. They found the men about a quarter mile away, trying to cross through a cornfield to get to a truck they'd parked on some agricultural access road. All 3 were arrested. Turns out they were high on methamphetamine, carrying hunting knives, more drugs, and had been casing our house for days because they thought we were dealing. Apparently, college kids renting a remote farmhouse fit some profile in their drug-addled minds. The neighbors in the trailer, they'd left 2 days before after a particularly bad fight, and these guys had been squatting there, watching us, planning this. The police said we were lucky, that meth psychosis mixed with weapons usually doesn't end with everyone walking away unharmed. I finished my internship sleeping on a friend's couch in town. Jordan and Blake broke the lease the next day. None of us ever went back to pack properly. We hired movers to get our stuff while a police officer supervised. I still have nightmares about that eye in the gap, still jump when I hear doorknobs turn, still can't live anywhere that doesn't have a deadbolt, a chain, and preferably a security system. It was the middle of August 2016 when everything happened, and I was 12 years old. spending another long afternoon at our family's farm outside Riverside while my parents drove into town for supplies. We lived about 20 minutes from the nearest grocery store, down a gravel road that kicked up dust clouds whenever anyone drove past, which wasn't often. I remember sitting on our front porch that day, reading one of those young adult novels about kids solving mysteries, completely absorbed in the story while our tabby cat, Whiskers, dozed in a patch of sunlight near my feet. The cicadas were buzzing so loud it almost hurt your ears, and the air was thick with humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin the moment you stepped outside. When I heard footsteps on the gravel, I looked up to see Mr. Donovan walking up our driveway, and my first thought was relief because I knew him from church. He ran the hardware store downtown and always gave me butterscotch candies when my dad brought me along to buy supplies. He was wearing his usual plaid shirt, but it was untucked and wrinkled, and his gray hair looked messier than normal, like he'd been running his fingers through it over and over again. He gave me this big smile when he saw me, the kind adults do when they're trying to seem friendly, but something's bothering them, and asked if my parents were home. When I told him they'd gone to town, he asked if he could use our phone because his truck broke down about a mile up the road, and his cell phone was dead, which made sense because nobody got good reception out here anyway. I let him inside because that's what you do when someone you know needs help, especially someone who's been nothing but kind to you for years. The landline was in the kitchen, mounted on the wall next to the refrigerator covered in my school papers and family photos from last Christmas. Mr. Donovan followed me inside, and I noticed he kept glancing out the window, checking the driveway like he was expecting someone. He picked up the phone receiver, held it to his ear for a moment, then set it back down without dialing anything. "Actually, sweetie," he said, and his voice sounded different, tighter somehow. "Would it be all right if I got a glass of water first? That walk in this heat really got to me." I went to the cabinet to grab a glass, and when I turned back around, he wasn't in the kitchen anymore. I found him standing by the living room window, peering through the curtains at something outside, and that's when I started getting this uncomfortable feeling in my chest, like when you know you're about to get in trouble but you're not sure why yet. He must have heard me because he turned around quickly and gave me that same too big smile, saying he thought he heard his buddy's truck coming to pick him up, but it must have been nothing. The way he kept moving around our house, touching things, running his hand along the back of our couch, picking up and setting down the ceramic rooster my mom collected, reminded me of how our dog acted during thunderstorms, all restless energy with nowhere to go. He asked if my parents said when they'd be back, and when I told him probably another hour or two, he nodded like he was doing math in his head, calculating something I couldn't understand. That's when we both heard it, the sound of tires on gravel, multiple vehicles from the sound of it coming fast down our driveway. Mr. Donovan's whole body went rigid, and the color drained from his face so quickly, it was like watching someone age 10 years in a second. Through the window, I could see 2 sheriff's department cars pulling up to our house, their lights flashing but no sirens, and my first thought was that something had happened to my parents. But Mr. Donovan grabbed my shoulder, not hard enough to hurt but firm enough to get my attention, and said in this low, urgent voice, "Listen, honey, those officers are confused about something. I need to step out back for just a minute to avoid any misunderstanding, okay? Can you tell them nobody's here?" His fingers were trembling against my shoulder, and there were beads of sweat rolling down his temples, even though our air conditioning was running full blast. Before I could answer or even process what he was asking me to do, he was already moving toward our back door, the one that led out toward the barn and the chicken coops. The doorbell rang, followed by heavy knocking, and I stood there in our living room, my mind racing between answering the door and following Mr. Donovan to ask what was happening. Through the front window, I could see 2 deputies standing on our porch, their hands resting on their belts in that casual but ready way cops always seem to stand. One of them, a woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, saw me through the window and gave me a small wave, mouthing, "It's okay," through the glass. Mr. Donovan had already disappeared through the back door, and I watched through the kitchen window as he jogged toward our barn, looking back at the house every few steps like a spooked deer. I opened the front door because I didn't know what else to do, and the female deputy immediately crouched down to my eye level, her voice calm and steady like she was trying not to spook me. "Hi there, sweetheart. I'm Deputy Morrison and this is Deputy Tanner. Are your parents home?" When I shook my head no, she asked if any adults were with me, and I hesitated for just a second too long before saying no. Deputy Tanner, a younger man with a sunburn across his nose, must have caught that hesitation because he exchanged a quick glance with Deputy Morrison. She asked if they could come inside to make sure everything was okay, and as they stepped into our living room, I noticed how their eyes swept every corner, taking in details I'd never paid attention to. The back door slightly ajar, Mr. Donovan's muddy footprints on our hardwood floor, the glass of water I'd gotten him still sitting untouched on the kitchen counter. Deputy Morrison asked me gentle questions while Deputy Tanner walked through our house, checking rooms with practiced efficiency. Had anyone been here today? Did I know a man named Carl Donovan? Was I hurt or scared? The questions came soft but steady, and with each one, I felt like the floor was tilting beneath me because I was starting to understand that Mr. Donovan, the man who'd sold my dad lumber and taught my Sunday school class 2 years ago, had lied to me about everything. Deputy Tanner came back from checking the bedrooms and whispered something to Deputy Morrison, who nodded and spoke into her radio, calling for backup to check the property's outbuildings. Through the kitchen window, I could see our barn door was slightly open, just a crack but enough that I knew Mr. Donovan was in there, probably crouched behind the hay bales or up in the loft where we stored old furniture. More deputies arrived within minutes, and they moved across our property like they'd rehearsed it 100 times, spreading out to surround the barn while Deputy Morrison stayed with me in the living room. She kept talking to me in that same calm voice, explaining that Mr. Donovan needed to answer some questions about something that had happened in town, but I could barely focus on her words because I was watching through the window as 4 officers positioned themselves around the barn's exits. One of them had a megaphone and called out for Mr. Donovan to come out with his hands visible, that they just wanted to talk, but the barn stayed silent except for our rooster who chose that exact moment to crow from his pen nearby. The waiting felt endless, like those seconds between lightning and thunder when you're counting to see how close the storm is, and I kept thinking about all the times Mr. Donovan had been at our house before, helping my dad fix the fence, bringing us fresh eggs from his chickens, always so normal and friendly. Then I saw him emerge from the barn's side door, the one we hardly ever used because it stuck in the frame, and you had to shoulder it hard to get it open. His hands were raised above his head, and even from inside the house I could see his shoulders shaking. The deputies moved in quickly but carefully, and within seconds they had him in handcuffs, leading him toward one of the patrol cars. As they walked him past our kitchen window, Mr. Donovan looked right at me, and his face had this expression I'll never forget. Not anger or fear, but something like disappointment, like I'd let him down by not lying for him. Deputy Morrison must have seen me staring because she gently turned me away from the window and asked if I wanted to call my parents, but my throat felt so tight I could only nod. My parents came home in a rush of slamming car doors and panicked voices, and my mom held me so tight I could barely breathe while my dad talked to the deputies outside. Later, after all the police cars had left and we were sitting around our kitchen table eating takeout Chinese food, because nobody felt like cooking, they told me what Deputy Morrison had explained to them. Mr. Donovan had been embezzling money from 3 different churches in the county, including ours, taking small amounts from donation funds over the past 5 years, not enough for anyone to notice right away, but it added up to nearly $40,000. That morning, the church treasurer had finally discovered the discrepancies and called the police, and Mr. Donovan must have seen the patrol cars at his house when he drove past. Instead of turning himself in, he'd abandoned his truck down the road and walked to our farm, probably thinking he could hide out until dark, and then slip away, using me and our house as cover while he figured out his next move. What haunts me most about that day isn't the fear I felt when I realized something was wrong, or even the shock of learning that someone I trusted had been lying to everyone for years. It's the way he acted so normal at first, relying on my familiarity with him, counting on a 12-year-old's instinct to help someone they knew. My parents installed better locks after that, and got me a cell phone earlier than they'd planned, but the real change was inside me. That little voice that now questions things, that notices when someone's story doesn't quite add up, that understands how someone can use your trust like a tool. The church got most of the money back through insurance, and Mr. Donovan went to prison for 3 years. But I still think about that afternoon sometimes, especially when I drive past our old barn, remembering how thin the line is between the people we think we know and who they really are when they're desperate. I grew up in a small rural town where everybody knew each other's routines without even trying. At that time, I was working at the feed store on Main Street, so I saw most of the farmers and their families come through at least once a week. One couple stood out more than the rest, Thomas and his wife, Linda. They lived on the far edge of town, close to the tree line where the fields started giving way to swampy ground. He was quiet, kept to himself, but she was the one who'd always show up at the market with baskets of eggs and jars of preserves. Linda had this habit of wearing bright scarves, even when the weather didn't call for it, as if she wanted a piece of color with her wherever she went. After a while, people started noticing she wasn't around as much. At first, nobody said anything. It's not unusual for folks to skip a week or two at the market if things are busy on the farm. But when a month rolled by without Linda showing up, whispers started circling. What stuck with me was the last time I saw her. She came into the store alone, moving slower than usual, and I caught sight of a dark bruise peeking out from under her scarf. She tugged it higher the moment she realized I noticed. She gave me a nod and didn't say much, just bought a few bags of feed and left. That image stuck with me like a photograph burned into my head. The rumors grew heavier when folks mentioned hearing shouting late at night from their property. Some said they saw Linda in the yard days after, looking pale, like she hadn't slept. One neighbor claimed she heard a crash loud enough to wake her dogs, followed by silence that felt unnatural. People started connecting the dots, but no one wanted to accuse Thomas outright. He had a reputation for being territorial. He'd bark at anyone who so much as stepped a boot onto his land. He had already fought with neighbors about fencing and livestock straying onto his pasture, and his temper seemed to get worse after Linda disappeared from public view. I tried to push it out of my mind until one afternoon Thomas stormed into the store, red-faced, demanding to know who had been snooping around his property. His voice carried through the aisles, sharp and threatening, and even old Mr. Hanley, who'd been in town longer than anyone, avoided eye contact. Thomas's hands were calloused and cracked, and he slammed them on the counter when I tried to explain nobody had been on his land. There was something in the way he glared at me that made me realize this wasn't just about property lines anymore. It felt like he was daring anyone to question what had happened to Linda. Things escalated fast after that. A couple of weeks later, Thomas was standing at the edge of the Simmons property, screaming about their goats crossing the fence line. The Simmons' youngest boy told me later he'd never seen a man so furious, veins bulging in his neck as he waved a rusted pitchfork like it was a weapon. People started avoiding that stretch of road, even in broad daylight. What unsettled me the most was how empty his farm looked now. The laundry line that Linda used to hang with bright scarves and dresses stayed bare, swaying in the wind, like it was waiting for something that would never return. One evening I stayed late at the store closing up and noticed Thomas's truck parked near the church lot, engine running with no lights on. It sat there for nearly an hour before finally pulling away. The next morning, Pastor Collins mentioned finding boot prints circling the building. They didn't lead anywhere, just loops around the back near the windows. It put the whole town on edge. People were locking their doors earlier, drawing curtains tight, things we didn't normally do in a place where most folks left their keys under flower pots. The sheriff finally paid Thomas a visit, but it didn't calm anyone down. Word spread that he had shouted at the deputy until his face turned purple, accusing everyone of conspiring against him. The strangest part was how quiet the farm remained otherwise. No sign of Linda, no animals grazing near the fences, no movement around the barn. From the road, it looked like a stage set left behind after the actors walked out. That eerie stillness made the rumors louder. Some swore they'd heard a woman's voice crying in the night. Others claimed to see a shadow moving inside the farmhouse window when Thomas was in town. I couldn't shake the memory of Linda's last visit to the store, the way her eyes darted like she was searching for someone safe to talk to, and how quickly she disappeared after paying. Every time I thought about it, I wondered if that was her silent way of asking for help, and I just didn't catch on soon enough. It's hard to explain, but from that moment on, the air in our little town felt heavier, like we were all waiting for a truth too ugly to admit. Nobody dared confront him directly, but the silence from that farm spoke louder than any accusation we could have made. It was late autumn when everything came to a head. The leaves had turned brittle, and the air carried that sharp chill that seeps into your bones. I remember driving past Thomas's farm after dropping off a delivery, and the sight stopped me cold. The front door stood wide open, swaying slightly in the wind. No truck in the driveway, no sound from inside. For a man as paranoid as him, leaving his door open was unthinkable. I parked down the road and called the sheriff before even stepping closer. A few other neighbors gathered, drawn by the same uneasy curiosity. No one wanted to go in, but none of us could leave either. When the deputies arrived, they moved carefully through the house. We waited outside in silence, every creak of the old boards inside carrying across the yard. After what felt like forever, they came back out with strained expressions. They wouldn't share much, just said the place was in disarray. Later, we heard from one of the deputy's cousins that the upstairs bedroom was torn apart, dresser drawers yanked out, clothes scattered everywhere, but not a trace of Linda. In the cellar, they found muddy boots and a torn scarf caught on a nail, bright red like the ones she always wore. That detail spread through town faster than any official statement ever could. Thomas never returned. His truck was found abandoned near the river a week later, keys still in the ignition. Search teams combed the woods and dragged the water, but they didn't recover a body. What unsettled me most was how quickly the authorities seemed to want the whole thing to go quiet. They boarded up the farmhouse and locked the gate, as if sealing away questions they didn't want to answer. The land stayed untouched, weeds growing high, windows staring blankly like eyes watching the road. Some people whispered that Linda's family knew more than they let on, but no proof ever surfaced. The silence from everyone involved was louder than shouting. Even now, years later, whenever I drive past that overgrown stretch of land, I think about Linda's last look at me in the store, and how maybe she had been reaching out in her own quiet way. Our town still doesn't speak openly about it. We avoid the topic like a wound that never healed. I carry the weight of wondering whether I should have done something when I saw that bruise, when I noticed the scarves pulled too high on her neck. Maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe it would have. What I do know is that both of them vanished, and the ground they left behind feels haunted, not by ghosts, but by secrets buried too deep for anyone to admit.